In the grand, unyielding edifice of the Roman Empire, a world built of marble law and iron, there existed a chasm more profound than any valley, more absolute than any border, the gulf between master and slave. One was a person, a citizen, a being endowed with rights, a name, and a future. The other was property, res, a thing, an instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice. In this world, a master's power over his slave was absolute, the power of life and death, of pleasure and pain, a whim that could alter a destiny without a moment's thought. What then could grow in such barren and poisoned soil? The story of a forbidden love between master and slave is not a romance. It is a tragedy. It is an exploration of a bond born in the crucible of absolute inequality. It is a whisper in a world of commands, a fragile warmth in a house of cold stone. Such a connection could never be one of equals. For the slave, is it truly love? Or is it the desperate clinging gratitude for a sliver of kindness in a universe of brutality? Is it a survival instinct, a deep and understandable attachment to the source of one's food, shelter, and safety from the whip? Is it the Stockholm Syndrome of the ancient world, a soul bonding with its captor? For the master, is it love? Or is it the ultimate act of possession, a fascination with an object that can think and feel, a beautiful bird one has captured for a gilded cage? Is it a rebellion against the strictures of his own society, or a weakness, a dangerous folly that threatens his name, his family, his political future? To love a slave was to invite scorn, to be seen as decadent, perverse, and weak. It was a transgression, not just against social norms, but against the very foundation of Roman power, which rested on the clear, unshakable distinction between the owner and the owned. This is the treacherous landscape we are about to enter. We will walk with a soul who is owned and watch as her heart is slowly, dangerously, and perhaps foolishly given to the one man who holds the deed to her very existence. We will witness the intoxicating illusion of intimacy and the brutal reality of the power that underpins it. This is a story about the complexities of the human heart, its desperate need for connection, and its tragic ability to find something akin to love in the most impossible of circumstances. It is a story of what happens when a whisper of affection tries to make itself heard over the roar of ownership, and the bitter price that must be paid for such a dangerous, forbidden dream. The air in the septa, Julia repurposed for a massive slave auction, was thick with the smells of sweat, fear, and expensive perfume. Alara stood on the turning platform, the catasta her feet whitened with the chalk of a new import, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floorboards. She was 19, and her world had ended 3 months ago, when her father, a respected Athenian scribe, had been ruined by a political enemy and forced to sell his assets to cover his debts. Those assets had included his only daughter. She was an object amidst a sea of objects. Before her, a brawny Thracian had been sold for work in the mines. After her would come a family of Syrians, their hands calloused from farming. But Alara was an anomaly. The titulus hung around her neck read, Alara, Athenian, 19, wires, literate in Greek, familiar with Latin, healthy, Virgo. The auctioneer made much of her literacy. A prize for a thinking man's household, a reader, a librarian, a tutor for your children, he bellowed. Men in the crowd looked her over their eyes, a mixture of crude assessment and calculation. Their gazes made her skin crawl. She felt like a trapped bird. Her wings clipped her frantic heart, beating against the bars of her ribs. Then a man stepped forward from the crowd, and a respectful hush fell over his immediate vicinity. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was, and strikingly different from the other bidders. Where they were florid and loud, he was quiet and composed. He was dressed in a simple dark toga of a scholar, not a senator, his face pale and serious, his eyes holding an intense, thoughtful quality. He was not looking at her body as the others had. He was looking at her face, at her eyes. He raised a hand, silencing the auctioneer. In a clear, quiet voice, he spoke not in the harsh Latin of the market, but in the classical Greek of her father's study. "Who is your favorite poet?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so utterly out of place in this theater of human commerce, that for a moment Alara could not respond. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a buyer, but a scholar. An instinct buried deep beneath her terror rose to the surface. "Sappho." She whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. A flicker of something surprise appreciation passed through his eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer. "I will take her," he said in Latin. "Name your price." The bidding was brief. The young scholar stated a sum so high, so far beyond the normal price for a household slave, that it stunned the crowd into silence. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack that sealed Alara's fate. She had been bought, not by a brute or a lecher, but by a quiet, serious young man who had asked her about poetry. She did not know if this made her the luckiest or the most unfortunate girl in the world. The young man's name was Cassius Verus. He was the sole heir to a moderate fortune and a magnificent villa on the Esquiline Hill, a house known more for its library than for its lavish parties. His father, a renowned historian, had died a year prior, leaving Cassius in charge of an estate he seemed ill-suited to manage. When Alara arrived at the villa, led by a stern household manager who clearly disapproved of his new master's expensive, impulsive purchase, she was struck by the silence. The house was not filled with the clamor of a large, bustling family, but with the quiet, scholarly peace of a sanctuary. The air smelled of beeswax and old papyrus. The frescoes on the walls depicted not scenes of conquest, but the muses, the great philosophers of Athens, and landscapes from Homer's Odyssey. She was handed over to the Vilica, the household overseer. Her name was Lyra, a freedwoman of the old master who had chosen to stay on as staff. She was a woman in her 40s, with shrewd, world-weary eyes, and a face that had forgotten how to smile. She looked Alara over with a critical, unimpressed gaze. "So, you are the new one?" Lyra said, her voice dry. "The master paid a fortune for you. He has more coins than sense." She took in Alara's fine-boned features and uncalloused hands. "You are not built for hard labor. We will see what use you are." The other slaves watched Alara with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They kept their distance. They whispered amongst themselves about the strange young master who spent more time with his scrolls than with his friends, and who had now paid a senator's price for a Greek girl who looked like she might break if she had to haul a bucket of water. Alara felt their resentment like a physical barrier. In this house, it seemed the master's favor was a dangerous and isolating thing to possess. Alara's first assigned duty was simple: to serve Cassius his evening meal in his private dining room. She was terrified. Her hands trembled as she carried the silver tray, her mind replaying every horror story she had ever heard about the tempers and cruelties of masters. She set the platter of roasted fowl on the table, her movements stiff with fear. As she reached to pour the wine, her shaking hand bumped against the goblet, spilling a few crimson drops onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. She froze her blood, turning to ice. It was a mistake, a flaw. In the household, where she had been briefly held before the auction, such a blunder would have earned her a swift, brutal cuff to the head. She braced herself for the blow, her eyes squeezed shut. But the blow never came. "It is only wine," a quiet voice said. Alara opened her eyes. Cassius was looking at the stain not with anger, but with a mild, almost indifferent expression. "Helena," he called out not loudly. A moment later, another slave girl appeared. "Bring a fresh cloth for the table." He then looked at Alara, whose face was a mask of terrified disbelief. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. "It is a simple mistake." He then returned to the scroll he had been reading, dismissing the incident as if it were of no consequence. Alara stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering. The absence of cruelty was a more profound shock than its presence would have been. In her world, a master's power was expressed through casual brutality. It was the background radiation of her existence. This quiet, gentle response was a deviation so profound it left her dizzy. She had been treated not as a flawed object to be punished, but as a person who had made a mistake. This small, simple act of kindness was the most terrifying thing that had happened to her all day. It was a crack in the wall of her understanding of the world. And into that crack, a dangerous, insidious seed of gratitude began to take root. The household overseer Lyra observed the master's interaction with his new slave, and her lips thinned in disapproval. She had served the old master Cassius's father for 20 years first as a slave, and then after her manumission as his most trusted servant. She understood the proper order of a Roman household. She understood the necessary distance between master and slave, a distance maintained by discipline and a healthy measure of fear. The young master, in her opinion, was dangerously soft. He had his father's love of books, but none of his father's stern pragmatism. He treated his slaves not as property, but as flawed, inefficient employees. She found Alara the next morning cleaning the lamps in the atrium. "The master was lenient with you yesterday," Lyra said, her voice sharp. Alara flinched, expecting a delayed punishment. "Do not mistake his nature for weakness." Lyra continued, her eyes hard, "or his kindness for affection. A master's favor is a fickle and dangerous thing, girl. It shines on you one day, and the next, it is the heat that burns you. It sets you apart from the rest of us. It makes you a target." She gestured to the other slaves who were scrubbing the floors nearby, their heads bowed, pretending not to listen. "Here we are, a family of a sort, a family of oxen yoked to the same cart. We pull together. We endure together. When the master chooses one ox to adorn with ribbons, the others grow resentful. They might jostle it or kick it. Do you understand?" "Yes, Vilica," Alara whispered. "Good," Lyra said, though her expression showed she doubted Alara truly understood the depth of the warning. "Do your work. Be silent. Be invisible. That is the path to a long and quiet life in a house like this. A master's kindness is a gilded leash. It may feel lighter than an iron chain, but it binds you just as tight and often more cruelly." Lyra walked away, leaving Alara with the chilling warning. The overseer, the former slave, understood the truth of their world far better than the gentle scholar who ruled it. She saw the kindness not as a gift, but as a trap. And Alara was the mouse hesitating just before the bait. For a week, Alara was assigned a series of simple menial tasks. She served meals, she cleaned, she mended linens. She did her work in a state of quiet, nervous diligence, terrified of making another mistake. Cassius rarely spoke to her beyond giving a simple command, but she was always aware of his presence, of his thoughtful, observing eyes. One afternoon, he summoned her. She entered his study, the largest and most impressive room in the villa, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of scrolls. It was the famous library of Cassius's father. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the high windows. The air smelled of knowledge. "The man who sold you said you were literate," Cassius said, gesturing to the overwhelming collection of books. "My father was a great historian, but not a tidy one. His scrolls are in disarray. His catalog is years out of date. I need someone to put them in order, to clean them, to read the titles, and to create a new, accurate catalog on wax tablets." Alara stared at him, stunned. This was not the work of a common slave. This was the work of a scribe, a scholar. It required skill, intelligence, and trust. "You want me to do this, Dominus?" She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "You read Greek, do you not?" "Yes, Dominus. It is my native tongue." "Then you are the most qualified person in this house," he said, with a simple, unassailable logic that ignored their respective stations entirely. "The task is yours. Lyra will show you where the tablets and styluses are kept. I trust your work will be meticulous." He turned back to the scroll he was studying, the matter settled. Alara was left standing in the middle of the magnificent library, a sanctuary of learning that was to be her new domain. It was an unheard-of privilege. She was being given a responsibility that acknowledged her mind, not just her body. It was a gesture of trust so profound that it terrified her. Lyra's warning about the gilded leash echoed in her ears. The leash had just been fastened, and it was made of papyrus and ink. Alara lost herself in the library. It was a refuge, a return to a world she thought she had lost forever. The simple, methodical work of cleaning the delicate scrolls, of reading the faded titles, of carefully inscribing the new catalog was a balm to her wounded soul. Here, surrounded by the words of poets and philosophers, she could almost forget the bronze collar on her neck. She worked for hours in silence, often in the same room as Cassius, who would be at his own desk, deeply engrossed in his research. The silence between them was not the tense, fearful silence of a slave and master, but the comfortable, companionable silence of two scholars sharing a space. One afternoon, while cataloging a section of lyric poetry, she unrolled a scroll, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a collection of poems by Sappho, her favorite, the one she had named at the auction. Without thinking, she began to read a few lines aloud. Her voice, a soft, quiet whisper, the Greek verses feeling like a prayer on her tongue. "And on my soft couch I will think of you." Fragment 31. Cassius's voice said from across the room, "A beautiful and tragic choice. He argues that the physical symptoms of love are akin to the terror of facing death." Alara froze, mortified at having been caught. "My apologies, Dominus. I was distracted." "Do not apologize," he said, rising from his desk and walking over to her. He looked at the scroll in her hands. "Her work is rarely found so complete. My father acquired this copy from a collector in Alexandria." He pointed to a line. "This verse here. My father believed it was mistranslated in the common editions. What is your interpretation?" And just like that, they were no longer master and slave. They were two minds, two intellects, discussing the nuances of a 200-year-old poem. He listened to her opinion with a serious, focused attention, as if she were a visiting scholar, not his property. He argued a point with her, his eyes alight with intellectual passion. The moment was intoxicating. It was a meeting of minds, a recognition of her worth that went beyond her duties. For those few minutes standing in the sunlit library, discussing poetry, she felt almost free. She felt seen. And it was this feeling, more than any physical kindness, that began to twist the gratitude in her heart into something far more complex and dangerous. The world outside the library did not share its scholarly peace. Ilara's new position as the master's librarian set her completely apart from the other slaves, and their suspicion quickly hardened into open resentment. She no longer took her meals with them in the noisy kitchen. A tray was brought to her in the library. She no longer slept in the common barracks. She was given a small private cell near the study, a profound luxury that was also a profound isolation. The whispers followed her whenever she had to pass through the service quarters. There goes the Greek pet. They say he reads poetry to her. Reads poetry, I wager he does more than that in that dusty old room all day. The jealousy was a palpable thing. The other slaves saw a girl who did no hard labor, who was given better food and lodging, who spent her days in the silent, privileged world of the master. They did not see the terror, the uncertainty, the constant weight of her precarious position. They saw only the favor, and they hated her for it. One evening, as she returned to her cell, Helena, the laundry slave from her first day, deliberately blocked her path. You think you are better than us now, little scholar? Helena sneered, her eyes full of contempt. With your clean hands in your quiet room, you are still a slave. And when he tires of you, and he will, you will be back in the laundry with the rest of us, and you will find no friends here. The threat was clear. Ilara's elevation had come at the price of all community. She was an island, her survival tied completely to the whim of one man. If he were to tire of her, if his favor were to shift, she would be cast back into a sea of hostile faces with no one to help her. The whispers were a constant reminder of the razor's edge upon which she lived. One morning, Cassius summoned her to his desk. Lying upon it was a new tunic. It was not the coarse, undyed wool of a common slave, or even the better gray wool she'd been given for her library work. This was a stola of fine, dark blue linen, the kind a free Roman woman of modest means might wear. The gray tunic is not suitable for your work. Cassius set his eyes on the scroll before him as if he were embarrassed. This will be more comfortable. It was a gift, an intimate gift. A master did not concern himself with the comfort or color of his slave's clothing. Ilara stared at the fine linen, her heart a confused, fluttering bird. "Thank you, Dominus," she whispered. "It is too much. It is nothing," he said, dismissing it. "Now I need you to find the scrolls pertaining to the Second Punic War." She took the garment back to her cell and put it on. The fabric was soft and cool against her skin, a world away from the scratchy wool. It was beautiful. It made her feel beautiful. But as she looked at her faint reflection in a polished bronze water basin, she saw the truth. The fine blue linen was a cage. The soft fabric was a leash. It was a mark of his ownership, a declaration to the entire household that she was his set apart and possessed in a way that went beyond mere servitude. Every privilege he gave her, the private room, the better food, this beautiful garment, was another golden link in the chain that bound her to him. It was a chain forged of gratitude and dependency, and it was becoming stronger every day. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. A master's kindness is a gilded leash. She now understood the overseer's warning perfectly. The leash was beautiful, and its weight was almost imperceptible, but it was tightening around her soul. The greatest privilege, and the most dangerous, was that Cassius began to see her. He started to ask her questions that had nothing to do with her work. "Ilara," he said one afternoon, looking up from his work. He used her name, a simple act that was a profound affirmation of her existence. "You are from Athens. Tell me of the city now. Is the spirit of Pericles truly dead, as the old men in the Senate claim?" Hesitantly, at first she began to speak of her home. She told him of the city she knew, of the bustling agora, of the scent of olive groves after a rain, of the way the sun struck the Parthenon at dawn. She spoke of her father, of his love of knowledge, of the small house filled with books where she had grown up. He listened with an intense, focused curiosity. For Cassius, who had only ever known Rome, her stories were a window into another world. For Ilara to speak of her past was to reclaim it, to give voice to the person she had been before she became property. These conversations became their new ritual. He asked about her childhood, about her education, about her beliefs. He treated her memories with a scholar's respect, as a text to be studied and understood. She was acutely aware of the danger. She was revealing herself to her master, giving him the keys to her innermost self. But it was a temptation she could not resist. To be seen as a person, to have her past acknowledged and her thoughts valued, was a drug more intoxicating than any wine. She began to see him differently, too. Not just as Dominus, the master, the source of all power, but as Cassius, a quiet, lonely man burdened by a great legacy who preferred the company of dead poets to living Romans. A man who, like her, found solace and meaning in the world of words. The absolute line between them, the chasm between master and slave, began to seem less absolute. It began to feel terrifyingly like a bridge. Part 1 concludes with Ilara alone in the library, late one night, a single oil lamp burning beside her. She had finished her cataloging for the day, but she had stayed, preferring the quiet company of the scrolls to the hostile silence of her solitary cell. She ran her hand over a leather-bound copy of Plato's Symposium, a dialogue on the nature of love. A month ago, she was an object on a platform waiting to be sold like livestock. Now she was the trusted keeper of a great library. Her mind engaged her body safe from the casual cruelties of her station. She was clothed in fine linen. Her master knew her name. He knew the name of her father. He knew her favorite poet. A profound and dangerous hope was blooming in her heart. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a marble floor. She was beginning to feel something for this quiet, kind master, an attachment, a loyalty that went beyond a slave's duty. She was beginning to mistake the absence of cruelty for affection. She was beginning to mistake intellectual companionship for intimacy. She was beginning to mistake her utter dependency on him for a bond of the heart. She knew on some deep instinctual level that this was a path to ruin. She remembered Lyra's warning. She felt the weight of the gilded leash. But the human heart starved of kindness will mistake a single drop of rain for a life-giving spring. As she sat there, the scent of old papyrus, her only companion Ilara, allowed herself to hope. She hoped that this strange, gentle man might be different, that their shared world of words could be a sanctuary, that his kindness was the beginning of a story, not the prelude to a tragedy. It was a foolish, dangerous, and utterly human hope. And the seed of it, now firmly planted, was destined to grow into a beautiful, heartbreaking, and forbidden flower. Ilara's life settled into a new and strange rhythm. She became a ghost in the house of Varus. Her world shrank to the quiet, sun-dusted corridor that connected her small cell to the grand library. She would rise before dawn, take her solitary meal, and then enter the sanctuary of the scrolls, often not emerging until long after dusk. She moved silently, her presence felt by the other slaves only as a fleeting shadow, or the distant soft rustle of papyrus. The back-breaking labor and the constant overt fear of her first days were gone, replaced by a quiet humming tension. The loneliness was profound. The other slaves, following Helena's lead, treated her with a cold, resentful courtesy. They would answer her questions with single words, their eyes averted, their body language a clear wall of exclusion. She was the master's pet and creature set apart, and they made sure she felt the chill of that isolation. In a way, the library became her only true home, Cassius, her only companion. She learned the landscape of his mind through the books he read and the notes he left in the margins. She saw his frustration with the verbosity of Tacitus, his admiration for the clarity of Thucydides, his quiet passion for the lyricism of Catullus. She was safe, she was warm, she was intellectually stimulated. By the brutal standards of her world, she was living a life of unimaginable privilege. But every night, as the door to her small, windowless cell closed, she was reminded of the truth. Her world was not a sanctuary, it was a cage. It was simply a larger and more beautifully furnished cage than the one the other slaves inhabited. And it had only one keeper. As Ilara delved deeper into the library's collection, she began to encounter the great Roman historians and orators, Livy, Sallust, Cicero. While she was familiar with the language, her Latin was that of a scholar, learned from texts, not the fluid, nuanced tongue of a native. Her progress on cataloging these Roman works was slow. One afternoon, Cassius observed her struggling with a particularly dense passage from Sallust's Conspiracy of Catiline. "Your Greek is flawless," he observed, his tone neutral. "But your Latin lacks the rhythm of the forum. It is the language of a foreigner." "It is Dominus," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with a scholar's shame. "This will not do," he said, though without any hint of anger. A librarian must be the master of the library's languages. From tomorrow, your duties will include an hour of study with me. We will read Cicero aloud. You will learn the proper cadence of a Roman sentence. And so their routine shifted again, becoming even more intimate. Every afternoon, after the main work of the day was done, the library would transform into a classroom. Cassius would sit opposite her, a scroll of Cicero's orations between them, and they would read. He was a demanding but patient teacher. He would correct her pronunciation, explain the complex grammatical structures, and deconstruct the rhetorical devices the great orator used to sway the Senate. The lessons were a pretext, a respectable framework for what was in truth an excuse to spend more time together. They were no longer just a master and his librarian. They were a tutor and his student. And in these quiet, scholarly hours, as their voices intertwined, reading the powerful prose of a long-dead consul, the distance between them seemed to shrink with every word, the chains of servitude fading into the background, replaced by the more subtle, more dangerous bonds of shared intellectual pursuit. During one of their lessons, Ilara's stylus, a simple, cheap instrument of wood and iron slipped from her nervous fingers and the point broke against the floor. She let out a small gasp of frustration. Cassius looked up, his gaze falling on the broken tool, then at the clumsy practice tablets she had been issued by the household. The next day, when she entered the library, a small wooden box was sitting on her work table. A proper scribe requires proper tools. Cassius set his back to her as he reshelved a scroll. "Open it." Hesitantly, Alara lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark cloth, was a new set of writing implements. There was a stylus of polished silver, perfectly weighted and balanced. There was a set of new wax tablets, the beeswax smooth and pale. And there was a sealed clay pot of high-quality sepia ink, the rich dark brown liquid favored by scholars and poets, and a finely cut reed pen. Alara stared at the gift, speechless. These were not the tools of a slave. They were the possessions of a professional scribe, a free person. It was a gift of immense value and even greater significance. It was an acknowledgement of her work, of her skill. It was an investment in her. "Thank you, Dominus," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I am not worthy of such a gift." "Nonsense," he said, still not looking at her. "A craftsman is only as good as his tools. I require the best work. Therefore, you shall have the best tools." His reasoning was cold and practical, but the gesture was anything but. It was an act of profound personal favor. Alara ran her finger over the cool, smooth silver of the stylus. It felt warm, as if it held the heat of his regard. She knew this was another link in the gilded chain, another debt of gratitude that bound her to him. But at that moment, it did not feel like a chain. It felt like a caress. The new writing tools did not go unnoticed. Lyra the overseer saw them during one of her rare inspections of the library. Her eyes, which missed nothing, lingered on the silver stylus, and her lips tightened into a thin, hard line. Later that evening, she found Alara as she was leaving the library. "The master buys you silver now," Lyra stated, her voice cold and sharp. "He dresses you in fine linen. He gives you the tools of a free woman. You must be very pleased with yourself." "They are to help me in my work," Alara said defensively. "Do not be a fool," Lyra snapped. "You are his work. You are the scroll he is writing on. And when the story is finished, he will put you back on the shelf." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Let me tell you a story, little Greek scholar, a true one. The old master, Cassius's father, once had a favored slave, a beautiful singer from Syria. He gave her silk dresses. He had her taught music by the finest tutors. He paraded her at his parties. The other slaves, they envied her. They thought she was a queen." Lyra's eyes were hard as stones. Then the old master arranged his son's marriage to a suitable girl from a good family. The Syrian singer was suddenly an embarrassment, a loose end. One day, she was simply gone, sold, to a brothel owner from Pompeii. We never heard of her again. The story hung in the air between them, a chilling, brutal parable. A master's affection is a luxury, Lyra concluded, her voice devoid of any pity. And when it becomes inconvenient, it is the first luxury to be discarded. Remember that the next time you hold your silver pen, it is a prettier chain, but it will not stop him from selling you when he is done with you." The overseer turned and walked away, her point made with surgical cruelty. The beautiful silver stylus suddenly felt as cold and heavy as a shackle in Alara's hand. Lyra's warning was a cold stone in Alara's heart. But the daily reality of her life with Cassius continued to weave its spell. She began to see past the master, past the scholar, and to glimpse the man beneath. And the man she saw was profoundly lonely. Occasionally, Cassius would be forced by social duty to entertain his peers' young men from other wealthy families. They would gather in the peristyle, their loud voices and boisterous laughter echoing through the quiet villa. Ilara, sometimes tasked with serving them wine, would observe her master in their company. He was a foreigner in his own world. His friends spoke of chariot races, of political gossip, of military campaigns, and the gladiatorial games. Cassius would stand at the edge of the group, a polite but distant smile on his face, contributing little to the conversation. His eyes held a look of weary boredom. He was a man of books and ideas trapped in a society that valued spectacle and power. Ilara realized with a jolt that she was his only true companion. The dead poets on his shelves were his friends, and she was their interpreter. The intense scholarly conversations they had were a form of intimacy he shared with no one else. The excitement in his eyes when they debated a historical point was a passion she never saw him display with his Roman friends. This realization shifted her feelings for him yet again. It added a layer of sympathy, of a strange protective pity to the gratitude and affection that were already taking root. She was not just his property. She was his confidant, his intellectual equal in a house where no one else understood him. It was a dangerous thought. It fed a sense of specialness, of irreplaceability that Lyra's story had warned her against. She began to feel that their connection was unique, that the rules of the world did not apply to them. She was no longer just a mouse before the bait. She was starting to believe that she was the only one who truly understood the man who had set the trap. The library was their shared world, a space governed by its own quiet rules. But the physical reality of their station's master and slave was a line that was never explicitly crossed. He sat at his desk, she at hers. He gave commands. She obeyed. But one afternoon, the invisible line was breached. They were working on a particularly old and fragile scroll, a fragment of a lost play by Euripides. It was brittle, and a small tear had begun to form along the edge. "We must mend this at once." Cassius said, a rare note of urgency in his voice. He retrieved the mending kit, a small pot of papyrus glue, and a strip of fine translucent linen. "Bring it here. This requires a delicate touch." Ilara carefully carried the fragile scroll to his large desk. He unrolled it, and she held one end, while he held the other to keep it flat. He meticulously applied a thin layer of the glue along the tear. "Now the linen strip." He murmured, his concentration absolute. "Lay it down very gently." He reached for the strip of linen at the same moment she did. Their fingers brushed. The touch was feather-light accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Ilara's entire body. It was the first time they had touched not as master and slave, not as a hand giving a tool or a steadying arm, but as two people reaching for the same object. His skin was warm, his hand surprisingly strong. They both pulled back as if burned. A sudden profound silence filled the room, thicker and more charged than any of their comfortable scholarly silences. Ilara could not look at him, her gaze fixed on the scroll, her cheeks on fire. She was acutely aware of him, of his breathing, of his proximity. The air between them seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. Without a word, Cassius picked up the linen strip and finished the repair. But the accidental touch lingered in the air. A boundary had been crossed. A question had been asked silently and unintentionally, and neither of them had an answer. After the incident with the scroll, the atmosphere in the library grew tense. The comfortable silence was replaced by a self-conscious awareness. Ilara, desperate to escape the suffocating intimacy of the room, began to take a short walk in the peristyle garden each evening, after her work was done, before she retired to her cell. The garden was her brief taste of freedom. The scent of jasmine and roses, the cool evening air, the sound of the fountain. It was a world away from the dusty scent of the library. One evening, as she was watching the last rays of the sun paint the sky purple and gold, she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. It was Cassius. She immediately stopped and bowed her head. "Dominus, do not let me disturb your walk." He said, his voice softer than usual. He came to stand beside her, not looking at her, but at the sky. They stood in silence for a moment. "You have been in Rome for almost a year now," he said quietly. "Tell me, Ilara, what does a Greek think of our Roman poets truly?" It was a simple question, but the way he asked it was different. He was not testing her knowledge. He was asking for her opinion, her true opinion. He was speaking to her not as his librarian, but as a person. "They are masters of order, Dominus," she said hesitantly. "Virgil builds his verses like a Roman architect builds a temple, perfect, strong, and glorious. But, he prompted, sometimes," she confessed, "I miss the chaos of the Greek heart, the madness of Sappho, the wildness of Homer. Roman poetry has great dignity, but it seldom weeps or screams." He was silent for a long moment, considering her words. "The chaos of the Greek heart," he repeated softly. "You are right. We Romans fear chaos. We build walls against it, in our cities and in our souls." They began to walk together, slowly around the colonnaded garden. They spoke of books, of cities, of the differences between their two worlds. The formal titles of Dominus and slave were not spoken. In the soft light of dusk, surrounded by the scent of flowers, they were simply a man and a woman talking. The illusion of equality was so perfect, so beautiful, that it made Ilara's heart ache. It was a dangerous, intoxicating dream, and she did not want to wake up. Ilara's unique position, her perceived influence over the master, was something she had only ever seen as a source of danger and isolation. But one day, she was given a chance to see it as a source of power. A young slave boy named Leo, who was tasked with dusting the outer rooms of the library, accidentally knocked a scroll off a low shelf. It was not a rare text, but a common copybook, and it was only slightly damaged. The wooden end cap cracked. But in the rigid world of the household, damaging the master's property was a serious offense. Leo, who was new and terrified, dissolved into tears, certain he would be whipped. Another slave ran to fetch Lyra the overseer. Ilara, hearing the commotion, stepped out of the inner library. She saw the weeping boy, the damaged scroll, and the other slaves looking on with a mixture of fear and grim anticipation. Ilara's heart went out to the boy. Before Lyra could arrive, before the formal machinery of household discipline could grind into motion, Ilara made a decision. She picked up the damaged scroll. "It was my fault," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the room. "I placed it too close to the edge of the shelf. I will take the blame, and I will repair it." The other slaves stared at her, stunned into silence by her audacity. At that moment, Cassius emerged from his study, drawn by the noise. "What is happening here?" he asked. "It is my fault, Dominus," Ilara said, stepping forward and bowing her head, holding out the damaged scroll. "I was careless. The boy Leo is blameless. I accept the punishment." Cassius looked from Ilara's determined face to the terrified, tear-streaked face of the boy. He looked at the minor damage to the cheap scroll. A flicker of understanding, perhaps even amusement, crossed his features. "There will be no punishment," he said, his voice calm. "The damage is insignificant. Ilara, you will repair it. Leo, you will be more careful. Now all of you return to your duties." He disappeared back into his study. Ilara had won. She had saved the boy from a beating. She felt a surge of pride, of strength. But as she looked at the faces of the other slaves, she saw no gratitude. She saw only a confirmation of what they already believed. She was the master's favorite, so powerful she could defy the rules and suffer no consequences. Her act of compassion had been interpreted as an act of arrogance. She had saved one boy from a whipping, but she had just built the wall between herself and the others 10 feet higher. The line between her waking life and her dreams began to blur. By day, she was the privileged slave, her world defined by the library and the quiet, intense presence of her master. By night, her mind would take the threads of her day and weave them into tapestries of impossible fantasy. One night, she had a dream so vivid it felt real. She was not in Rome. She was in Athens, walking through the shaded groves of the academy, the place where Plato had taught. The air was warm and smelled of dust and cypress. And she was not alone. Cassius was walking beside her. In the dream, they were both dressed in the simple white robes of Greek scholars. There were no collars, no titles. He was not her master. She was not his slave. They were equals, two minds walking together, engaged in a passionate, joyful debate about the nature of the soul. His face, which in life was so often serious and reserved, was animated with laughter. The dream was filled with a sense of rightness, of a world that was as it should be. The connection that was so fraught with danger and unspoken tension in the waking world was in the dream simple, pure, and free. She awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. She was not in Athens. She was in her small, dark, windowless cell in the heart of Rome. The dream's golden light was gone, replaced by the suffocating reality of her servitude. The silence was not the peaceful silence of the academy, but the dead silence of a prison. She lay on her straw mattress, tears streaming down her face. The dream had shown her what she truly yearned for, and in doing so, had illuminated the utter hopelessness of her real situation. She did not just feel affection for Cassius. She was falling in love with a fantasy. She was in love with the man she spoke to in the library in the garden, in her dreams, a man who in the real world did not and could not truly exist. The man who owned her was her master, and no amount of kindness could ever change that. The dream left a lingering sadness that Ilara could not shake. Her interactions with Cassius were now tinged with a new painful awareness of the chasm between her feelings and her reality. The library, once a sanctuary, now felt more like the beautiful set of a tragic play. One late afternoon, a profound silence settled over the room. A rainstorm had broken over Rome, and the sound of the rain drumming on the roof was a soft, steady rhythm. Ilara was at her table, carefully mending a tear in a scroll. Cassius was a book open before him, though he was not reading. He was watching her. She could feel his gaze. It was not the analytical gaze of the scholar or the proprietary gaze of the master. It was something else, something more intense, more personal. It was filled with a deep, conflicted melancholy that seemed to mirror her own. She looked up, and their eyes met across the room. The air grew thick, heavy, with all the words that had never been spoken between them. Words like love, freedom, hope impossible. His eyes were asking a question he could not voice. What is this that is growing between us? And her eyes were answering with a truth she could not say aloud. It is a beautiful, fragile, and doomed thing. The bond between them was now a palpable presence in the room, as real as the scent of the rain and the old papyrus. It was a bond of shared loneliness, of intellectual communion, of forbidden affection. Ilara looked at the man who owned her, and in his eyes she saw not a master, but a fellow prisoner, trapped with her in a cage of his own, making a cage of tradition, duty, and Roman law. The gilded leash was now so comfortable, so familiar, that she could almost forget it was a leash at all. She could almost believe that the hand that held it was the hand of a lover. Almost. The unspoken question hung in the air, a promise of both ecstasy and ruin, as the rain continued to fall on the cold marble of Rome. The library ceased to be a room in the villa. It became a world. It was a sovereign state with a population of 2, governed by the rustle of papyrus and the soft scratching of a stylus on wax. Ilara and Cassius developed rituals that were as deeply ingrained as any religious ceremony. In the mornings, she would prepare his workspace, laying out the scrolls she knew he would need, anticipating his research before he voiced it. In the afternoons, he would often ask her to read aloud, not from the dry histories of their lessons, but from the epic poems of Homer. Claiming the sound of her native Greek clarified the verses. They moved around each other in a comfortable, practiced silence, 2 celestial bodies in a quiet, orderly orbit. The household outside, with its resentments and rigid hierarchies, faded into a distant, muffled noise. Here, they were not master and slave. They were a shared intellect, a single scholarly pursuit divided between 2 bodies. Ilara felt the change in herself. The constant low-level fear that had been her companion for so long had been replaced by a sense of purpose. She was no longer just surviving. She was contributing. Her insights were valued. Her intelligence was a tool that was praised, not hidden. She was respected. And in this sanctuary, this bubble of intellectual intimacy, she allowed herself to forget the fundamental, brutal truth of her existence. She forgot that the door to the library could be locked at any time, that the scrolls she handled were not hers, and that the man who listened to her opinions with such rapt attention was the same man who held the legal deed to her life. In the sanctuary of the library, it was easy to forget that she was still a prisoner. Their studies progressed from the rhetoric of Cicero to the philosophy of the Stoics. One afternoon, they read a letter from Seneca, who argued that true freedom was an internal state, that a man could be a king in his own mind, even if his body was enslaved. An elegant idea, Cassius mused, setting the scroll down. That freedom is a virtue of the soul, untouched by external circumstance. That a slave who is master of his own thoughts is freer than an emperor who is a slave to his passions. For the first time, Ilara felt a spark of intellectual opposition. This was not a theoretical concept for her. It was her life. It is an idea dominus, she said, her voice quiet but firm, that could only be written by a man who has never been in chains. Cassius looked up, surprised by her directness. Explain. A man who is free to think what he wishes, but is not free to say what he thinks is not free, she said, choosing her words carefully. A man who is master of his soul, but whose body can be whipped, or sold, or violated at the whim of another, is not free. The freedom of the mind is a cold and lonely sanctuary when the walls of the flesh are a prison. It is the consolation prize of the powerless. Her words hung in the air, a quiet, devastating rebuttal born of lived experience. Cassius stared at her, and for the first time, he was not looking at his student or his librarian. He was looking at a slave and truly seeing the philosophical and physical reality of her condition. He had no counter-argument. Her truth was more powerful than Seneca's elegant prose. The debate left a subtle fracture in their idyllic world. It was a reminder of the chasm between them, a chasm that no amount of shared poetry could truly bridge. He was a man who theorized about freedom. She was a woman who lived in its absence. The debate seemed to unlock something in Cassius. He grew more reflective, more personal. He began to speak to her not just of books, but of himself. One evening, as a storm raged outside, trapping them in the lamp-lit warmth of the library, he confessed his own feelings of being caged. "My father was a great man." Cassius said, his voice low, his gaze lost in the flickering lamp flame. "A historian, a senator, a true Roman. He expected me to follow his path, to pursue a career in the Senate or to command a legion, to be a man of action, of power." He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "I have no taste for it, Alara. The forum is a nest of vipers, and the battlefield is a butcher's yard. My friends talk of glory and conquest. I see only noise and bloodshed." He looked at her, his eyes holding a vulnerability she had never seen before. "My only ambition," he confessed, "is to do what my father did in his spare time, to read, to study, to write. I want to write a history of the Greek philosophical schools, or perhaps a collection of poems about the gods. That is the man I am. But it is not the man Evarus is expected to be." Ilara listened, her heart aching with a sudden fierce wave of empathy. He, in his own way, was as much a prisoner of his station as she was of hers. He was trapped by the expectations of his name, his family, his society. His confession was an act of immense trust, a sharing of a secret vulnerability. He was showing her the man behind the mask of the Dominus. In that moment, she felt a dangerous and powerful shift. She was no longer just a sympathetic ear. She felt like his only true ally, the only person in his world who saw and understood the quiet, scholarly soul he kept hidden from the harsh judgment of Rome. His newfound openness led him to show her the most secret part of the library, his father's tabularium, the map room. It was a small circular chamber, its walls covered not with scrolls, but with magnificent hand-painted maps of the known world, drawn on vast sheets of vellum. "My father believed you could not understand history without understanding geography." Cassius said, his voice filled with a rare, uncomplicated reverence for his father's work. He unrolled a magnificent map of the Greek city-states, its coastlines traced in gold leaf. "Show me," he said softly. "Show me your home." With a trembling finger, Alara pointed to the small dot labeled Athene. And as he stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers, she traced the path of her terrible journey across the Aegean Sea, through the port of Brundisium and up the long, hard road of the Appian Way to Rome. He listened, his expression serious, his eyes on the map. He saw her not as a piece of merchandise that had simply appeared in Rome, but as a person who had been violently uprooted from a place with its own history, its own geography. One day, he said, his voice a low whisper almost to himself, "I would like to see it. The way the sun strikes the Parthenon at dawn, as you described." The words were a quiet fantasy, an impossible dream. But in the close confines of the map room, with the whole world spread out before them, it felt real. He was no longer her master, and she was no longer his slave. They were two travelers, two souls looking at a map and dreaming of a journey they might one day take together. The illusion was so powerful, so complete, that it felt more real than the stone walls of the villa that surrounded them. The illusion did not extend beyond the library walls. The rest of the household was in a state of quiet, simmering rebellion, with the master so distracted by his Greek pet discipline had grown lax. Work was done sloppily. Whispers turned into audible grumbling. The delicate machinery of the domus was beginning to break down. Lyra, the overseer, saw the signs and knew the cause. Her patience, worn thin by the master's folly, finally snapped. She requested a formal audience with Cassius, a rare and serious step. She found him in the library, with Lyra working quietly in the corner. Lyra ignored the girl completely, her focus entirely on the master of the house. "Dominus," she began, her voice cold and formal. "I have served this house for 25 years. I have managed its affairs with efficiency and order. That order is now threatened." Cassius looked up, startled by her tone. "What are you talking about, Lyra?" "I am talking about the girl," Lyra said, still not looking at Alara, but the word hung in the air like a thrown spear. "Your favoritism has become a poison. The other slaves see it. They see you treat one of their own as an equal. They grow resentful. They see your kindness as weakness. They grow lazy. Work is being neglected. There is talk. There is insolence. The foundations of your authority are eroding." She took a deep breath. "I served your father. He was a hard man, but he was a fair one. He understood that a house like a legion requires discipline. It requires clear lines. You are erasing those lines." She finally looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You must choose Dominus. You can be a scholar who plays at being a master and watch your household descend into chaos. Or you can be the master of this house. But you cannot be both. This folly with the girl must end." It was an ultimatum delivered by a freed woman to her patron, a stunning and dangerous act of defiance. But it was also the undeniable truth. And as Ilara listened from the corner, her heart frozen with terror, she knew that Lyra was right. Lyra's words struck Cassius like a physical blow. He was a man of ideas, not of authority, and he had been blissfully, willfully ignorant of the effect his actions were having on the world outside his library. He was a Roman, the head of a noble house. The accusation that he was losing control, that his household was becoming disordered, was a deep and profound shame. He was shaken, and his reaction was swift and absolute. He retreated. The next morning, the warmth between them was gone, replaced by a wall of ice. He did not greet Alara when she entered the library. He did not look at her. He spoke to her, only to give curt formal orders. The cataloging of the Stoics is to be completed by the end of the week. He said, his voice cold, his eyes on a scroll. There will be no more Latin lessons. I am too occupied with other matters. The change was so abrupt, so total, that it left Alara reeling. The sanctuary had been violated. The comfortable orbit they had shared was broken. He had re-erected the wall between them, and it was higher and colder than ever before. Every gentle word, every shared look, every moment of intellectual intimacy felt like a dream she had woken from. She spent the day in an agony of confusion and heartbreak. Had she done something wrong? Was he finally tired of her? Or had Lyra's words truly destroyed everything? The silence in the library was no longer companionable. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with the ghosts of their recent intimacy. She had been a fool. A blind, naive fool. Lyra was right. She was a toy, a diversion, and her master, reminded of his duties, had simply put her back in her box. The pain of it was a physical thing, a hollow ache in her chest that was worse than any whipping. For 3 days, the cold silence persisted. Alara felt as if she were suffocating. The library, her refuge, had become a place of torment. She felt Cassius's presence like a physical weight, his coldness a constant painful rejection. She was heartbroken, lost. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, she sat in her cell, the beautiful silver stylus he had given her in her hand. She felt a desperate, overwhelming need to speak to bridge the silence that he had imposed. But she was a slave. She could not demand an audience. She could not ask him what she had done wrong. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She turned to words. She took a spare scrap of papyrus, the kind used for practice, and dipped her reed pen into the fine sepia ink. And in her elegant, practiced Greek, she wrote. It was not a letter. It was a poem. A short, simple lament. A thrush I knew from Attic skies, whose cage was gold, a fine surprise. But bars of gold are bars indeed. And silence planted a bitter seed. She soon forgot the songs of spring, the memory of a broken wing. Until one day, a flute-like sound, a half-remembered tune was found, and in her throat, a note took hold, a story waiting to be told. O lonely flutist, do not cease, for in your song is my release. It was a plea, a confession, and a declaration, all cloaked in metaphor. She wrote of her own despair, of his companionship being the song that had awakened her, and of her terror at his silence. It was the most honest and the most dangerous thing she had ever written. The next morning, with a trembling hand, she left the small piece of papyrus on his desk, placed centrally on the scroll he was due to read. Then she retreated to her own corner of the library, her heart hammering to await her fate. She had spoken, and now she was certain the punishment would be swift. Alara spent the morning in an agony of suspense. Cassius entered the library, saw the scrap of papyrus on his desk, and picked it up. She kept her eyes down, her hands clenched in her lap, her entire body braced for his anger. He was silent for a very long time. She could hear the faint crinkle of the papyrus as he held it. The silence stretched, becoming a form of torture. She risked a single fleeting glance. He was standing by the window, his back to her, holding her poem. His shoulders were rigid. He read it, and then he read it again. The hours crawled by. He did not speak. He did not work. He simply stood or sat lost in a profound inner turmoil. Alara's fear began to curdle into despair. Her poem had been a foolish, childish gesture. She had overstepped a final, unforgivable boundary. As dusk began to settle, he finally summoned her, Ilara, her name, was a quiet command. She rose her legs unsteady and approached his desk. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the floor, ready for the sentence to be passed. He was holding the poem. He did not speak. He simply reached out, and with a gentleness that shattered her composure, he took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm. He held her hand, a master holding the hand of his slave, but it did not feel like an act of ownership. It felt like an anchor. His coldness, the wall of ice he had built between them, had been melted by her 14 lines of Greek. Her words had reached him in a way Lyra's never could. Her poem had been a gamble of the heart, and against all odds, it had won. He finally looked at her, and the cold, distant mask of the Dominus was gone. In its place was the face of Cassius, the lonely scholar, his eyes filled with a deep, aching conflict. "I was a fool," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Lyra is right about the household. She is right about the rules, but she is wrong about this." He looked down at their joined hands. "She is wrong about us." The word "us" was a shocking, intimate thing. It was a word that should not exist between them. It was a word that acknowledged their bond as something real, something separate from the rigid structure of their world. This house, its rules, the expectations of my name. They are my cage, Ilara. He continued, his voice filled with a raw honesty. This library, and the time I spend here with you, is the only place I feel I can breathe. To give that up, it is a command I cannot obey, even from myself. The power dynamic for a dizzying, terrifying moment seemed to invert. He, the master, was confessing his weakness, his need for her. She, the slave, had with a simple poem influenced his will, changed his course. Her words had held more power over him than the pragmatic, sensible ultimatum of his most trusted servant. He was no longer just a kind master. He was a man being swayed by his emotions, by his affection for his slave. It was a profound indiscretion, a catastrophic failure of the gravitas expected of a Roman noble. And for Ilara, it was the most triumphant and terrifying moment of her life. The rain had stopped. The only sound in the lamp-lit library was their breathing. He was still holding her hand. He looked from her eyes to her lips, and she saw a deep, desperate longing that mirrored her own. The intellectual and emotional intimacy that had been building for months had reached its peak. The dam of restraint, which he had tried to rebuild, had been shattered by her poem. They were standing on the brink of a precipice, a line from which there would be no return. The meeting of minds was about to become something more, something tangible, physical, and infinitely more dangerous. The unspoken question that had hung between them for so long was about to be answered not with words, but with an act that would either seal their bond or shatter their world forever. For a few precious weeks after the night of the poem, the library became a world transformed. The unspoken question had been answered with a shared silent acknowledgement. The bond between Ilara and Cassius was no longer a thing of subtext and stolen glances. It was a quiet, powerful current that flowed between them, a fragile understanding that they were allies against the cold formality of the world. He was more gentle, more attentive. She in turn felt a blossoming confidence, a sense of security that was as intoxicating as it was illusory. They existed in a bubble of shared verses and quiet companionship. The household under Lyra's grim and watchful eye seemed to recede, its resentments and rules a distant annoyance. They had created a sanctuary, and in their shared folly, they began to believe it was impregnable. But the world outside the villa walls had not ceased to exist. It was a world of alliances, duties, and promises made long before a Greek slave girl had ever set foot in Rome. A courier arrived one morning, breaking the scholarly peace with the clatter of his sandals in the atrium. He brought a message for the master. Alara was organizing scrolls. When Cassius returned to the library, the message in his hand, a look of complex, troubled resignation on his face. "There is news," he said, not looking at her. "My betrothed, the Lady Cornelia, returns to Rome with her family from their summer villa in Baiae. They will be in the city for the autumn season. She is expected to visit, to begin overseeing the household arrangements for our wedding in the spring." The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. My betrothed. She had known, in an abstract sense, that a man of his station would have a suitable match arranged. But she had pushed the thought away, consigning it to a distant, irrelevant future. Now that future had arrived. A name Cornelia had been given to the faceless threat. A shadow was falling over their sanctuary, and it was the shadow of a Roman noblewoman. Alara knew of the Cornelii family. Even in Athens, their name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. They were one of Rome's oldest and most powerful patrician families, a lineage that had produced consuls and generals for centuries. Cornelia was the only daughter of the formidable Senator Cornelius Scipio, a man of immense political influence and ruthless ambition. The marriage between Cassius and Cornelia had been arranged by their fathers when they were children. It was a perfect match on papyrus, the old scholarly wealth of the Varus family, joined with the aggressive political power of the Cornelii. It was an alliance. It had nothing to do with love. When Cornelia arrived at the villa a week later, Alara understood at once that this was a woman who would not be denied her due. She was beautiful, but not in the soft, poetic way Alara might have admired. It was a sharp, severe Roman beauty. Her dark hair was intricately braided in the latest fashion, her profile was as clear and commanding as a figure on a coin, and her dark eyes missed nothing. She moved, not with grace, but with an unshakable aristocratic confidence. She was a woman who had been raised from birth to be the domina of a great house, and she wore her entitlement like a fine silk stola. She was everything Alara was not: Roman free, powerful, and promised. Alara was in the atrium, polishing a bronze statue of Minerva, when the grand doors were thrown open to admit the visitors. Senator Scipio, a bull of a man with a booming voice, entered first, followed by his wife, and then Cornelia. Cassius greeted them with the formal, stiff courtesy required by his station. Alara kept her head bowed, her hands still trying to make herself as small and invisible as a mouse. But she could feel the weight of Cornelia's gaze as the young noblewoman surveyed her future home. Cornelia's eyes swept the atrium, assessing the quality of the mosaics, the cleanliness of the marble, the arrangement of the ancestral busts. And then her gaze fell on Alara. It was a long, dissecting look. She noted Alara's features so clearly, not Roman. She noted the fine blue linen of her tunic, a quality of garment not typically worn by a slave polishing statues. And she noted the brief, almost imperceptible flicker of Cassius's eyes in Alara's direction, a moment of concern he could not quite conceal. Cornelia said nothing. Her expression did not change, but a seed of cold, calculating suspicion was planted in that instant. She had the sharp instincts of a predator, and she had just caught the scent of something out of place in her future territory. The battle for the house of Varus had begun, and Alara, the unwitting casus belli, was only just beginning to understand that she was on the field. Cornelia did not wait for the wedding to begin asserting her authority. As the future domina, it was her right and her duty to ensure the household was being run to her exacting standards. She began a systematic inspection of the villa with Lyra as her tight-lipped guide and Cassius trailing awkwardly behind them. She found the kitchens insufficiently clean, the linens not properly bleached, the slaves in the weaving room too slow. Her critiques were sharp, public, and designed to establish her dominance. Lyra received them with a stony, resentful deference. The tour finally brought them to the library. When Cornelia swept in, she stopped her lip, curling in a faint sneer, as she took in the scent of old papyrus. "So this is where you hide yourself, Cassius," she said, her voice a silken barb, "with your dusty old ghosts." Her eyes then fell upon Alara, who stood frozen by her work table. "And what is this?" Cornelia asked, her voice dripping with condescending amusement. She did not address Alara, but spoke of her to Cassius as if she were a curious piece of furniture. "Lyra tells me you keep a slave as a librarian. Alara is highly educated." Cassius said, his voice tight. "She is of great assistance to my work." "A great assistance," Cornelia repeated, drawing out the words. She walked slowly around Alara, looking her up and down with an insulting, appraising gaze, as if she were inspecting a horse. "What an eccentric folly! A waste of a good asset. Look at her hands. They are soft. She should be spinning wool, not turning pages. Spinning is a far more suitable occupation for her kind." The insult was a deliberate public humiliation. It was a clear statement. "Whatever you are in this room, to me you are just a slave, and I will put you to a slave's work." Alara stood in stony silence, her cheeks burning, feeling the walls of her sanctuary begin to crumble around her. Cornelia's assault was just beginning. Over the next few days, she seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting Alara, using her newfound authority as a weapon in a subtle, undeclared war. It was a test, a series of provocations designed to probe the boundaries of Cassius's attachment to his Greek slave. She would demand that Alara be the one to serve her specifically at meals. She would find fault with everything: the wine was too warm, the bread was cut too thick, and deliver the criticisms with a sharp, cutting tone for Cassius to hear. The worst was a small dinner party Cassius was obliged to host for Cornelia's family. Cornelia insisted that Alara be one of the slave girls tasked with holding the fans to keep the guests cool. For hours, Alara was forced to stand behind Cornelia's couch, her arm aching, her entire being reduced to a mindless, mechanical function. She had to listen to their conversation, to their arrogant pronouncements on politics and philosophy subjects she discussed as an equal with Cassius in the library. At one point, Cornelia, feigning a sudden chill, commanded Alara to drape a shawl over her shoulders. As Alara did so, Cornelia deliberately leaned back, knocking the fan from Alara's exhausted hand. It clattered to the floor. "Clumsy girl!" Cornelia snapped loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It seems her hands are as useless for this as they are for spinning." Alara saw the flash of anger in Cassius's eyes. She saw him open his mouth to defend her. But then he met the cold, challenging gaze of Cornelia's father across the table, and the words died in his throat. He said nothing. He simply motioned for another slave to pick up the fan. Alara was left standing there, her shame a burning cloak, her master's silence a scream of betrayal. Cassius was trapped. He was a Roman nobleman of the Republic's dying light. Duty, family, and political alliance were the pillars of his world. His affection for Alara was a private, secret thing, a fragile vine growing in the shadow of these great marble pillars. In a direct conflict, the vine stood no chance. He could not openly defy Cornelia, his betrothed, in her own future home. To do so would be a catastrophic insult to her and her powerful father, Senator Scipio. It would endanger the alliance, his family's honor, and his own future. So he compromised. And every compromise felt like a small death to Ilara. He would endure Cornelia's public torment of Ilara in silence. He would watch as his fiancée assigned Ilara humiliating tasks, his face a tight mask of frustrated inaction. But then later, when Cornelia had left, he would quietly countermand the orders. He would find Lyra and instruct her that Ilara was needed for urgent work in the library, pulling her back from the kitchens or the weaving rooms. He thought he was protecting her. He thought these were clever, necessary maneuvers to keep the peace while preserving their private world. But Ilara saw it differently. She saw a man who would stand by in silence while she was humiliated. She saw a man whose affection was a coward, hiding in the shadows, only emerging when the danger had passed. The beautiful illusion of equality they had built in the library was being systematically dismantled by Cornelia's cruelty, and more painfully, by Cassius's own weakness. He was her protector, only when it cost him nothing. When a price was demanded, she was the one who was forced to pay it. Lyra. The overseer watched the drama unfold with the grim, knowing eyes of a prophetess seeing her predictions come true. She saw Cornelia's calculated cruelty, Cassius's weak compromises, and the dawning heartbreak in Ilara's eyes. She felt no pity, only a bitter, cynical vindication. She found Ilara one evening in the laundry, a place Ilara had not been since her first days sent there by Cornelia, on a whim, to learn the value of honest work. Ilara's soft scholar's hands were red and raw from the harsh lye soap. So, Lyra began, her voice devoid of inflection. The Lady Cornelia arrives, and the master's pet librarian finds herself scrubbing tunics. This must be a surprise to you. Ilara said nothing, continuing to scrub a stained piece of linen with a furious, desperate energy. Did you truly believe it would last? Lyra pressed her voice, a low, cutting whisper. Did you think his world had room for you? Look at her, the Lady Cornelia. She is his world. Patrician, powerful Roman. She will give him sons who are citizens. She will advance his family's name. She is his duty, his future. She paused, letting the words sink in. And what are you, girl? You are a pleasant diversion, a secret, a book he enjoys reading in his spare time. But a man will always put his library away when important guests arrive. He has to. It is the Roman way. Lyra's words were cruel, but they were also the undeniable truth. Ilara was the master's pleasure. Cornelia was his purpose. And in Rome, purpose always triumphed over pleasure. The knowledge was a cold, hard knot in Ilara's stomach, more painful than the sting of the lie on her hands. The final brutal lesson in the reality of her situation came in the form of a small silver object. A few weeks prior, in a moment of unguarded affection, Cassius had given Ilara a small gift. It was a simple silver brooch, shaped like a swan, that he had bought from a Greek trader in the Forum. It was not lavish, but it was a personal, intimate gesture. She wore it to fasten her stola, and it was her most treasured possession, a secret symbol of his regard. Cornelia, with her hawk-like eyes, noticed it immediately. One afternoon, she found Ilara in the garden, cutting flowers for the dining room. Cornelia approached her, a predatory smile on her lips. Cassius was nearby, reading on a marble bench. "What a quaint little pin," Cornelia said, her voice deceptively sweet. She reached out and touched the silver swan on Alara's shoulder. A pretty little thing. Far too pretty for a slave. Alara froze, her blood running cold. She knew what was coming. Cornelia looked from the brooch to Cassius, a clear, challenging look in her eyes. Then she turned back to Alara. "Give it to me, girl," she said, her voice now hard as iron. "A gift is wasted on you. It will look better on a Roman." Her hand shot out. She did not wait for Alara to unfasten it. She simply grabbed the brooch and ripped it from the fabric of Alara's stola, tearing the fine linen. She held the silver swan in her palm, a triumphant trophy. Alara stood there, her stola torn, her heart shattered. She looked at Cassius. He was watching, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He had seen the entire calculated act of theft and humiliation. He had seen his own gift ripped from the woman he supposedly cared for, and he did nothing. He said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze back to his scroll, a silent, damning act of surrender. The silence from Cassius was more devastating than any shout. He had allowed it to happen. He had watched her be violated and had chosen his duty, his fiancé, his political future over her. Later that day, he sought her out in the library. The air was thick with a new, terrible tension. "Alara," he began, his voice low and strained. "About what happened in the garden. Cornelia she can be what?" Dominus Alara interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. The respectful title was a deliberate, bitter irony. Powerful Roman, your future wife. She was all of those things today. "You do not understand the complexities," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Her father is a powerful man. My marriage to her is a cornerstone of my family's position. To defy her over a trifle. The word escaped her like a gasp of pain. "It was your gift. It was a symbol. And you let her tear it from me like a common thief stealing from a beggar. You watched, and you said nothing." For the first time, she was not his grateful student or his adoring pet. She was a woman scorned and betrayed, and her anger gave her a courage she had never possessed. Lyra was right, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "I am a book you read in your spare time, and you have just put me back on the shelf because your important guests have arrived. Did you think I did not know I was your property, Dominus? I have never forgotten. It was you, I think, who was pretending to forget. The beautiful illusion of their equality, the fantasy of their shared sanctuary, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was his secret. She was his shame. And his inaction in the garden had proven it beyond all doubt." Alara fled to her cell, her heart a wasteland of grief and disillusionment. Cornelia had won. The dream was over. She was a fool, a naive little Greek slave who had mistaken a gilded cage for a home. She curled up on her cot, the torn fabric of her stola, a tangible reminder of her humiliation, and wept. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, she heard a soft scratching at her door. Her heart leapt with fear. Had Cornelia sent someone to punish her for her insolence? The door creaked open. It was Cassius. His face was a pale shadow in the darkness, his eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing guilt. A master did not visit a slave's cell. It was a profound, shocking transgression of every rule of their world. "Alara," he whispered, his voice raw. He stepped inside the small room, barely able to contain his presence. "I am sorry. By the gods, I am so sorry." You were right. I was a coward." He looked around at the tiny bare cell, at the straw mattress, at the cold stone walls. He was seeing, truly seeing, for the first time the reality of her existence, the world she inhabited when she was not in his beautiful library. "I am trapped," he said, his voice cracking. "Torn between the man I am expected to be and the man I am when I am with you." He knelt by her cot, an unheard-of gesture of supplication from a master to a slave. "I cannot lose you, Alara. I cannot." The air between them was thick with his guilt and her pain. The careful boundaries, the lines of master and slave, had been completely dissolved by the day's betrayals and this final, desperate transgression. He was no longer the master in control. He was a man tormented and desperate, reaching for the only source of comfort he had. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers gently wiping away a tear. The moment had arrived, the point of no return. All the unspoken questions, all the forbidden longing, all the intellectual intimacy was about to collapse into a single physical act that would seal their fate and set them on a course for inevitable ruin. He knelt before her in the suffocating darkness of her cell, the master before the slave, the man before the woman he had wronged. The air was thick with his guilt and her tears. All the rules, all the rigid lines that defined their world had dissolved in that moment. "I cannot lose you," he whispered again, his voice a raw testament to his desperation. He reached up, his touch hesitant, and his thumb gently brushed away a tear from her cheek. The gesture was so tender, so impossibly intimate, that it broke through the last of her defenses. In his eyes, she saw not the power of the dominus, but the desperate plea of a lonely man. And in her own heart, the anger and betrayal were suddenly overwhelmingly consumed by a wave of sorrowful affection for this man who was both her captor and her only companion. He leaned in, and the world seemed to slow, the air growing thick and heavy. When his lips met hers, it was not an act of force or ownership. It was a hesitant, questioning touch, as soft and fragile as a moth's wing. It was a shared confession, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible thing that had grown between them in the quiet of the library. For Ilara, the kiss was a cataclysm. It was a surrender. It was the terrifying, intoxicating fulfillment of a dream she had not dared to admit, even to herself. All the pain of the day, all the humiliation, seemed to melt away in that single stolen moment of tenderness. She was not a slave. He was not a master. They were just two souls finding a desperate solace in a world determined to keep them apart. The transgression was absolute. The final line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. And as the kiss deepened, a shared act of reckless, hopeless devotion, they had no idea that they were not sealing a bond of love, but igniting the very pyre that would eventually consume them both. Ilara awoke the next morning in her cot, the memory of the night before a phantom touch still lingering on her lips. The world felt fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The gray light that filtered under her cell door seemed brighter. The cold stone walls felt less like a prison and more like a secret sanctuary. She felt a dizzying, chaotic mix of emotions. There was a soaring, incredulous joy. He had chosen her. He had come to her, humbled himself, and shown her his heart. But beneath the joy was a deep thrumming undercurrent of terror. What they had done was not just forbidden, it was a crime. It was a subversion of the natural order of their world, an act for which the consequences were unimaginable. When she entered the library that morning, The air was charged with their shared secret. Cassius was already there, and when he looked at her, his usual scholarly reserve was gone, replaced by a look of such tender protective affection that it made her heart ache. He was more attentive, more gentle than ever before. He spoke to her in low, intimate tones, even when discussing the driest of historical texts. Their secret was a silent, invisible thread that now connected them, a shared conspiracy that made every glance, every word, every rustle of papyrus a part of their new, dangerous language. She was no longer just his librarian. She was his secret, and she was beginning to realize that the two things might ultimately mean the same thing. Cornelia was a creature of power, and her senses were acutely attuned to its shifting currents. She could not know the specifics of what had transpired in the slave's cell, but she felt the change in the atmosphere of the house immediately. The master was different. His awkward deference to her was gone, replaced by a cool, polite distance. His attempts to placate her had ceased. When she made a demand regarding Alara, insisting the girl be sent to the weaving room, Cassius refused. "No," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Her work in the library is too important. She is not to be disturbed." It was the first time he had ever openly defied her. The challenge was unmistakable. Cornelia looked from his resolute face to the Greek slave girl who now stood with a new quiet composure. She saw the secret, unspoken understanding that passed between them in a single glance. Her suspicion, which had been a simmering coal, now burst into a cold, hard flame of certainty. Something had happened. Some line had been crossed. The master's folly had escalated into a full-blown, dangerous affair. She no longer saw Alara as a mere annoyance, a low-born rival to be swatted aside. She now saw her as a serious threat, a disease that was infecting her betrothed and jeopardizing the political alliance that was her birthright. Her objective shifted from petty torment to something far more serious. She began to watch them, not with the arrogance of a superior, but with the patient, calculating gaze of a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to expose them and destroy the girl for good. Having crossed the ultimate boundary, Cassius was a changed man. The guilt of his betrayal of Alara in the garden and the exhilaration of their transgression in her cell had combined to burn away much of his previous caution. He was a man in the grip of a powerful, all-consuming passion, and it made him reckless. He began to shower Alara with gifts no longer cloaked in the guise of scholarly necessity. One day, he returned from the forum and presented her with a small leather-bound scroll. It was a new edition of Sappho's poetry, a rare and expensive copy he had bought specially for her. "A library should have more than one copy of the greats," he said, but his eyes told her the truth. "This is for you." Another time, he brought her a perfect sun-ripened peach, a delicacy imported from Persia at a time of year when such fruit was almost priceless. He watched her eat it, a look of simple, unadorned pleasure on his face. These were not the actions of a master. They were the gestures of a lover. And each gift, each special act of favor, was another piece of kindling added to the pyre Cornelia was building. Alara accepted them with a heart torn between joy and terror. Each gift was a proof of his affection, a testament to their special bond. But she knew with a growing sense of dread that each gift was also a piece of evidence, a nail being hammered into the coffin of their secret world. The new recklessness of the master sent a wave of alarm through the household. It was one thing to favor a slave in private. It was another to parade the affair so openly with gifts and blatant disregard for the household's order. Lyra. The overseer saw the disaster coming as clearly as a sailor sees a storm gathering on the horizon. She cornered Ilara one evening as the girl was returning to her cell, the precious scroll of Sappho clutched in her hands. "So he buys you poetry now?" Lyra said, her voice heavy with a grim, weary sadness. The scorn was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like pity. "Do you know what you are to him now, girl? You are no longer his pet. You are his morbus, his sickness, his obsession." Ilara recoiled, but Lyra pressed on. "I have seen this before. A powerful man, bored with his own world, becomes fascinated by a slave. He convinces himself it is love. He thinks he can have both his world and his secret. He is wrong. An obsession like this is a fire. It either consumes the man, or he is forced to extinguish it." She looked at Ilara, her eyes holding the wisdom of a long and brutal life. And when a man like Cassius Verus is forced to choose between his world and his obsession, he will always, always choose his world. And the fire is extinguished by dousing it in the blood of the one who started the flame. There is no happy ending for you here. There is only a conclusion. Flee from his heart, girl, if you cannot flee from his house. It is the only escape you have left. Lyra's final warning was the most chilling of all. She was no longer talking about a fall from favor. She was talking about destruction. The sanctuary of the library was no longer safe. Cornelia now made a habit of sweeping through it, unannounced, her presence a constant jarring intrusion. She was hunting. One afternoon, Cassius was showing Ilara a detail on an old illuminated manuscript, a beautiful depiction of Orpheus and Eurydice. To see the fine detail, they were huddled close together, their heads bent over the page, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The moment was innocent, scholarly, but their proximity was intimate. Suddenly, the curtain to the library was ripped aside. Cornelia stood there, her face a mask of cold fury. They sprang apart, guilt written plainly on their faces. Cassius snatched his hand back, as if from a fire. Ilara's cheeks flushed a deep telltale crimson. "Am I interrupting something?" Cornelia asked, her voice dangerously sweet. "Not at all," Cassius said, his voice strained, his attempt at nonchalance a dismal failure. "I was just showing Ilara a flaw in the manuscript's preservation, a matter of household maintenance." Cornelia's eyes flicked between them, a look of triumphant certainty on her face. She had seen it. She had not caught them in a kiss, but she had caught them in a moment of unguarded intimacy. She had the proof she needed. "Of course," she said, with a thin, cruel smile. "Maintenance. See that you attend to it." She turned and swept out of the room, leaving a trail of Arctic cold behind her. The close call left them both shaken. The bubble had been pierced. Their private world had been invaded, and they had been found out. The game was no longer about hiding their feelings. It was about surviving their discovery. That evening, Cornelia confronted Cassius. Ilara, hiding in the shadows of the atrium, overheard their raised voices from the study. An utter disgrace. Cornelia's voice was sharp as glass. "You stand with her, like a lovesick boy, for all the household to see. You humiliate me. You humiliate your family's name with this sordid obsession with a piece of Greek property. It is not what you think." Cassius's voice defensive and weak. "You are mistaken." "Am I?" Cornelia laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Then explain it to me. Explain why this slave is treated like a queen. Explain why you defy me for her. Explain why you cannot keep your hands and your eyes from her. Cassius was trapped. The truth was indefensible. So he did what cornered men do. He lied. She is not my obsession. He set his voice, gaining a false, desperate strength. She is my duty. My father, before he died, was working on his magnum opus, a definitive history of the Peloponnesian War. He died before it was finished. The notes are in a disastrous state. Ilara is the only person I have found with the knowledge of Athenian dialects to help me decipher them. It is a matter of honoring my father's legacy. My attention to her is purely academic. It was a brilliant, plausible lie. It appealed to the Roman values of patriarchal duty and legacy. It transformed his passion into a noble scholarly pursuit. There was a moment of silence. Your father's legacy. Cornelia repeated her voice, skeptical, but for the moment without a counter-argument. See that you complete it quickly, Cassius. My patience for your academic pursuits is not infinite. The lie had worked, but it was a dangerous one. It had bought them time, but it had also created a new conspiracy, a shared deception that bound Cassius and Ilara even tighter, pulling them deeper into a web from which there was no easy escape. Their relationship was now built on a foundation of lies. A lie to the household, a lie to Cornelia, and in many ways, a lie to themselves. The joy Ilara had felt after their first kiss began to curdle into a constant gnawing anxiety. She was living a double life. In the library, she was Cassius's cherished confidant, the recipient of his affection and his trust. But the moment she stepped out of that room, she was a pariah, the focus of Cornelia's hatred and the other slaves' scorn. The secret was a physical weight. She felt it in the tightening of her shoulders whenever Cornelia was near, in the way she had to force herself to meet Cassius's eyes with a look of cool deference in public. The guilt was a constant companion. She felt like a traitor to the memory of her own proud family for loving the man who represented the system that had destroyed them. And strangely, she felt a pang of guilt towards Cornelia. The Roman woman was cruel and arrogant, but she was also the one being betrayed. Ilara was the other woman, the secret shame, and no amount of love poetry could change that brutal fact. The stolen moments of tenderness with Cassius were now always tinged with the bitter taste of fear. The joy was real, but so was the terror. And she began to wonder if a love that could only exist in the shadows, a love built on lies and sustained by fear, was truly love at all. Her turmoil must have been visible on her face. Cassius, sensitive to her every mood, saw her growing anxiety. He knew that his lie to Cornelia was a temporary fix, that the net was tightening around them. One night, he came to her cell again. The act itself was still a shocking risk, but their affair had progressed beyond caution. He found her sitting on her cot, staring at the wall, her face a mask of sorrow. She will not break us. He set his voice a fierce, low whisper. He knelt before her and took her hands. I will not let her. What can you do? Ilara asked, her voice hollow. She is your betrothed. I am your slave. That is the only truth that matters in this house. No, he said, his grip tightening. The only truth that matters is what is in this room. He looked into her eyes, and she saw a desperate, reckless resolve she had never seen before. I will find a way, Ilara. I swear it. I will not marry her. I will break the betrothal. I will face my family, her family, the entire Senate if I have to. I will find a way for us to be together. It was a wild, impossible promise, the kind a man makes when he is drowning. To break a betrothal with the Cornelia family would mean political and social ruin. It was unthinkable, but Alara, starved for hope, clung to his words as a dying woman clings to a priest's prayer. She allowed herself to believe him. She allowed herself to imagine a future that was not a fantasy, a life with him beyond the walls of the library, beyond the shadow of servitude. She leaned forward and kissed him a kiss, not of tentative discovery, but of a desperate shared pact. They would defy the world together. In the weeks that followed, a strange false peace settled over the villa. Cassius, emboldened by his new resolve, created a fragile truce. He treated Cornelia with an unassailable, if cool, courtesy that gave her no new grounds for complaint. At the same time, he protected Alara, keeping her almost exclusively in the library, shielding her from Cornelia's authority. He was attempting to live his lie to honor his father's legacy by day and to love his Greek slave by night. They stole moments together whenever they could. A shared walk in the garden at dawn, a whispered conversation in the stacks of the library, a quick, charged touch of hands over a scroll. They existed in a precarious bubble of their own, making a temporary pocket of peace in a world that was still hostile to their very existence. They began to believe they could succeed. They thought their love, their secret, was something they could manage, something they could protect. They were wrong. They were lost in their own story, so absorbed in their personal drama that they failed to see the true nature of their enemy. Cornelia was not a woman to be placated by courtesy. She was a Roman, and she had been dishonored. Her patience had run out. She was no longer just watching. She was plotting. She was looking for a weapon, something so powerful and so final that it would not just remove the Greek slave from the house, but destroy her so completely that she would serve as a permanent lesson to the man who had dared to humiliate her. The calm was not peace. It was the deep, indrawn breath of the world before the storm breaks. Cornelia, having had her suspicions confirmed, underwent a subtle and terrifying transformation. The open scorn and petty torments ceased. She replaced them with a mask of cool, deceptive civility. She began to take a keen and sudden interest in the management of the household, shadowing Lyra on her daily rounds, asking intelligent questions about the inventories, the running costs, the duties of the senior slaves. To Cassius, this new demeanor was a relief. He foolishly interpreted it as her acceptance of the situation, a sign that his lie about his father's academic work had placated her. He saw a future domina responsibly learning her duties. Ilara and Lyra, however, knew better. They recognized the change for what it was. This was not acceptance. It was strategy. Cornelia had been a hawk striking from above. Now she had become a serpent, gliding silently through the grass, her eyes searching not for a target to attack, but for a vulnerability to exploit. She was no longer trying to win a battle of wills with Cassius. She was preparing to set a trap that would force him to destroy his own prized possession. She was no longer focused on Alara's actions. She was focused on finding a crime. The opportunity presented itself during the monthly inventory of the household silver. It was a formal, tedious process overseen by Lyra, where every silver platter goblet and wine jug was counted, weighed, and checked against the master's official records. Cornelia, in her new role as the diligent fiancée, insisted on being present. Halfway through the count, she feigned a look of confusion. "Lyra," she said, her voice carrying a note of carefully crafted concern. "The records list 12 of the large Sicilian serving platters, the ones with the Hercules motif. I only count 11. Lyra, startled, recounted them herself. Cornelia was right. One was missing. A frantic search of the silver pantry and the dining rooms was conducted. The platter, a heavy, valuable piece of silver, was nowhere to be found. A serious breach. Cornelia said, her eyes dark with feigned gravity. She looked at Cassius, who had been summoned. Theft in your own home, a sign of profound disorder. The trust you place in your slaves appears to have been misplaced. A thorough search of the slave quarters must be conducted at once. We must root out the thief before the rot spreads." Her logic was unassailable. A valuable object was missing. An investigation was the proper Roman response. Cassius, his face tight with annoyance and a flicker of dread, had no choice but to agree. He gave the order to Lyra. The serpent's trap was beginning to close. The theft, of course, was a fabrication. 2 nights prior, Cornelia had used a master key given to her by her indulgent future father-in-law to enter the silver pantry. She had taken the platter herself, wrapping it in a thick cloak and hiding it in the bottom of a large, seldom-used dowry chest in the rooms that had been assigned to her. Her plan was a masterpiece of insidious cruelty. It was not enough to simply accuse Alara. The master's affection might allow him to dismiss a simple accusation. She needed evidence, and she needed to poison the well of his sympathy. The night before the inventory, she had bribed one of the junior slave girls, a resentful, ambitious girl named Thalia, who loathed Alara for her privileges. For the price of a small silver coin and a promise of future favor, Thalia had crept into Alara's cell while she was in the library and stolen a simple personal object, a small carved wooden comb, a cheap trinket Alara had bought from a trader in her first weeks and kept to remind her of the olive wood groves of Greece. Then, under Cornelia's direction, Thalia had taken both the massive silver platter and the small wooden comb. She had not hidden them among Alara's things. That would be too simple, too direct. Instead, she had hidden them in the sleeping pallet of the young slave boy Leo, the very boy whom Alara had so publicly saved from punishment. The boy whom the entire household now saw as being under the Greek slave's special protection. The trap was not just a frame-up. It was a narrative. The cunning, intelligent Greek girl, too clever to steal for herself, had manipulated the simple-minded young boy she controlled into doing the dirty work for her. It was a story that was both believable and utterly damning. At Cornelia's insistence, the search of the slave quarters was conducted with grim public formality. Lyra and 2 household guards went from cell to cell, turning over thin mattresses, searching through meager belongings. The slaves stood in the corridor, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment as their small private worlds were violated. When they reached Leo's pallet, Lyra's hands found the hard, unyielding shape of the platter hidden beneath the straw. She pulled it out. The silver gleamed in the lamplight, a shocking, incriminating object. The boy, Leo, let out a terrified wail, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I did not. I swear by the gods, I never saw it before." Cornelia, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "And what is this?" she asked, reaching into the pallet and pulling out the small carved wooden comb. She held it up for all to see. "This is not the boy's. I have seen this comb before. I have seen it in the hands of the master's librarian." She turned her eyes, fixing on Alara, who had been brought to witness the search. The accusation, delivered with the cold precision of a striking snake, echoed in the silent corridor. "It is clear what has happened." Cornelia announced, her voice ringing with false authority. "This foolish boy would never have the courage for such a theft. He was a pawn, manipulated by the one person in this house clever enough to devise such a scheme and arrogant enough to believe she could get away with it. The Greek girl is the true thief." All eyes turned to Alara. She was trapped. The evidence, the motive, the narrative, it all pointed directly at her. She was framed not just for a crime, but for a betrayal of the very boy she had tried to protect. The accusation created an immediate crisis. This was no longer a matter of social impropriety or a stolen brooch. This was a formal charge of furtum, a serious crime. The evidence, however fabricated, was tangible. The accused were a known favorite and her young, simple-minded protege. The accuser was the master's powerful, unassailable betrothed. Cassius was summoned. He stood in the atrium, the silver platter laid on a table before him. Like a body at an inquest, a symbol of the broken order of his house. He was no longer a lover or a scholar. He was the paterfamilias, the head of the household, and he was required to be the judge. He looked at the faces before him. Cornelia, her expression a perfect mask of righteous indignation. Leo sobbing hysterically, incoherent with terror. Lyra, her face grim and impassive, the enforcer of the rules, waiting for a verdict. And Alara. She stood in a pool of dreadful calm, her face pale, but her eyes clear, meeting his gaze with a look that was not a plea for mercy, but a silent, desperate demand for his trust. He was in an impossible position. His heart, his intellect, everything he had come to feel for Alara, screamed that she was innocent. He knew Cornelia's jealousy, her capacity for cruelty. He knew this was a trap, but his duty as a Roman master, his obligations as a betrothed nobleman, pointed in the other direction. To declare Ilara innocent would be to openly, publicly accuse his future wife of orchestrating a malicious lie and framing a slave. It would be a catastrophic insult to the Corneli family. It would be political and social suicide. He would be seen as a weak, besotted fool, a man ruled by his passion for a slave, the most damning accusation that could be leveled against a Roman of his class. The entire foundation of his world was at stake. "Let us have order," Cassius said, his voice strained, trying to project an authority he did not feel. The interrogation was a grim, farcical performance of Roman justice played out in the cold atrium. He questioned Leo first. The boy was a mess of tears and denials. "I did not do it. Dominus Ilara is kind to me. She would never ask me to do such a thing." His very defense of her was twisted by Cornelia into proof of his blind devotion. Then Cassius turned to Alara. "You have heard the accusation," he said, his voice a formal, distant echo of the one that had once discussed poetry with her. "What say you? I am innocent, Dominus." Ilara said, her voice quiet but steady. "I have never seen that platter before, and I have not seen my comb since the night before last. I have stolen nothing from this house, which has given me shelter." Her denial was calm, intelligent, and articulate, and that was its flaw. "Of course she denies it," Cornelia interjected, her voice sharp. "She is clever. Is that not why you value her, Cassius? Her cleverness with words, she could talk a snake out of its own skin. Do not let her beguile you with her foreign tongue." Look at the evidence. The platter was found with the boy she protects. Her comb was found with the platter. The facts are as clear as the silver itself. Cassius looked at Alara, a desperate pleading expression in his eyes. He was searching for a way out, a flaw in Cornelia's logic. But there was none. It was a perfect trap. It was his word, his feeling, his trust in a slave against the tangible evidence and the rigid expectations of his entire world. The silence in the atrium was absolute. Every slave in the household was gathered, watching, waiting. This was more than a trial over a stolen platter. It was a trial over the soul of the house, a final battle between the master's private affection and his public duty. Cassius looked at Alara, and in her eyes he saw their shared world, the library, the quiet conversations, the stolen kiss. It was a world of the mind, of the heart. Then he looked at Cornelia, and in her cold, triumphant eyes he saw the real world, the world of political alliances, of family honor, of the Roman Senate, of his future. A world of marble and power and unyielding duty. He could choose Alara. He could defy Cornelia, declare his slave innocent, and face the catastrophic consequences. He could choose his heart. It would be a noble gesture, a stand for love and justice. It would also be his complete and utter ruin. Or he could choose his world. He could uphold the evidence, appease his fiancée, and restore the brutal necessary order of his household. He could choose his duty. It would be a betrayal of everything he felt, a sacrifice of the only true connection he had. It would be an act of cowardice. He was the wolf from his own parable. He was caught in a trap, and he had to make a choice. With a look of profound, agonizing torment on his face, he turned away from Alara and faced his household. He made his choice. The evidence is clear. Cassius announced his voice, a hollow, dead thing. He could not bring himself to look at Alara. A theft has occurred. The order of this house has been violated. There must be consequences. A collective silent gasp went through the gathered slaves. He had chosen. He had sided with Cornelia. The boy, Leo, Cassius continued, his voice strained, is young and foolish. He was clearly a pawn, but he participated in the theft. He will receive 20 lashes to teach him the price of disobedience. Leo let out a heartbroken wail. As for the mastermind, Cassius said, and the word was a drop of poison, the one who used her intelligence to manipulate and her position to steal, the punishment must be more severe. He finally forced himself to look at Alara. The look in her eyes was not anger, not hatred. It was a look of profound, silent, shattering disillusionment. It was the look of a soul that had just been murdered. Whipping you would be insufficient. He said the words costing him a visible effort. Your crime was one of arrogance, of forgetting your place. Therefore, you will be sent away. My family has a small farm in Etruria. It is a place of hard, honest labor. You will work there for 1 season. You will trade your stylus for a hoe. You will learn humility in the soil, and you will be reminded of what it is to be a slave. He was banishing her, casting her out. He framed it as a corrective punishment, but they all knew what it was. It was a sacrifice. He was sacrificing her to appease Cornelia, to save his engagement, to restore his authority. The matter is settled. He declared, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Lyra, see to it. He turned and strode quickly from the atrium, unable to witness the consequences of his own judgment. To Alara, the sentence was a death of 1,000 cuts. It was not just the punishment for a crime she did not commit. It was the absolute catastrophic betrayal of every shared word, every moment of intimacy, every promise whispered in the dark. The farm in Etruria was a notorious place, a rural backwater where disobedient or difficult slaves were sent to be broken by relentless backbreaking agricultural labor. It was a sentence of hard exile. He was casting her out of their sanctuary. He was taking away her library, her poetry, her world of the mind. He was sending her back to the world of physical misery she had briefly escaped. His promise to find a way for them to be together now rang in her ears as a sick, hollow joke. He had found a way, all right, a way to get rid of her, while maintaining the appearance of a stern, just master. Cornelia stood nearby, her face a perfect mask of cool satisfaction. She had won. She had not just defeated her rival. She had forced her lover to be the executioner. It was a total victory. Lyra approached Alara, her expression grim. There was no triumph in the overseer's eyes, only a weary resignation. "I warned you, girl," she said softly, her voice not unkind. "I warned you what a master's favor was worth." Alara said nothing. She simply stood there, her world in ruins, the love she had felt for him curdling into a cold, hard stone of grief in her chest. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it almost felt peaceful. It was the quiet that comes after the lightning strike has incinerated everything. The preparations were swift. Alara was taken from her cell. Her fine blue stola was stripped from her, along with her silver stylus and her scrolls of poetry. She was given back the single rough-spun tunic of a common drudge. She was once again a nameless, faceless piece of property. An hour later, a grim-faced farm overseer arrived to collect her. He was a hard, sun-beaten man with cruel eyes and calloused hands. He tied her wrists with a rough rope, as if she were a wild animal. As he led her through the great bronze gates of the villa, the same gates she had entered with such trepidation months ago, she allowed herself one last look back. She saw him. Cassius was standing in the window of the library, their sanctuary. He was a silhouette against the light. He was watching her go. His posture was one of sheer impotent anguish. He had made his choice, and now he was watching the price of it walk away in chains. Their eyes met one last time across the courtyard. There was no love in his gaze now, no affection. Only a terrible shared understanding of what he had done. He had chosen his world of marble and duty, and he had condemned her to a world of dirt and despair. The overseer gave the rope a vicious tug, pulling her forward. The gates of the villa boomed shut behind her. Her journey into exile had begun. She was paying the final bitter price for having been the object of a master's favor. The journey away from Rome was a grim parody of her arrival. When she had first traveled the Appian Way, she was a new valuable commodity. Her fear mingled with a sliver of curiosity about her fate. Now she was disgraced property, a problem being shipped to a remote location. She was not an asset. She was a punishment. She walked in a small train of slaves and supplies bound for the Varus family's country estate. Her hands were not bound, but the shame was a heavier shackle than any rope. The overseer of the farm, a hard, silent man named Cato, rode on a mule and looked at her with open contempt. He had been told she was a troublemaker from the city, an arrogant house slave who needed to be taught a lesson, and he was clearly eager to be her teacher. The other slaves in the train, seasoned agricultural workers, ignored her. They saw her soft hands, her pale skin, her fine-boned features, and they saw a creature who did not belong in their world of dirt and toil. To them, she was a liability, a city pet who would not last a week. As they traveled farther from Rome, the grand marble monuments gave way to dusty fields and simple farmsteads. With every mile, the world of the library of poetry and quiet conversation receded, becoming a faint, painful memory, like a dream that dissolves upon waking. The betrayal was a cold, constant ache in her chest. Cassius had chosen his world, and this dusty, brutal road was now hers. The Varus estate in Etruria was the absolute antithesis of the elegant villa in Rome. There were no mosaics, no frescoes, no colonnaded gardens. This was a working farm, a place of grim functionality. The master's villa was a simple, stark stone building, used only a few weeks out of the year. The heart of the estate was the slave barracks' long, low buildings of rough-hewn timber, the stables, the granaries, and the vast, unending fields of wheat and olives that stretched to the horizon. The air here did not smell of papyrus and beeswax. It smelled of manure, of damp earth, of the sweat of men and beasts. The sounds were not the gentle trickle of a fountain, but the lowing of oxen, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the shouts of the overseers. Ilara was shoved into the female slave barracks, a long, dark room, filled with 24 straw pallets laid out on a dirt floor. The women who lived there were a different breed from the house slaves in Rome. Their faces were weathered by the sun, their bodies hardened by relentless labor. They looked at Ilara, the newcomer, with the soft hands and the haunted eyes, with a mixture of suspicion and pity. They had seen girls like her before, sent from the city to be broken. Few of them ever left. This was her new home, a place without beauty, without knowledge, without a single echo of the life she had briefly, foolishly believed could be hers. Her work began the next day before dawn. She was handed a heavy, rough-handled hoe and sent to the fields to weed the rows of young wheat. The sun beat down merciless and white. The work was brutal, monotonous, and agonizing. Within an hour, her soft scholar's hands, accustomed to the smooth texture of papyrus and the light weight of a stylus, were raw and blistered. By midday, the blisters had broken and her hands were bleeding. The pain was a constant searing fire. Her back, unused to bending for hours on end, screamed in protest. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, profound exhaustion she had never known. She worked alongside the other women, who moved with a slow, steady, practiced rhythm that she could not hope to match. They did not speak to her. They watched her clumsy, painful efforts with a detached, silent judgment. This was a different kind of servitude. In the villa, the cruelty was often psychological, a matter of status and favor. Here it was elemental. It was the cruelty of the sun, of the hard, unforgiving earth, of the relentless, punishing labor that was designed to grind a person's body and spirit down to nothing. The world of the mind, the world where she had once felt like an equal, was a distant, mocking ghost. There was no poetry in the fields, only pain. The farm overseer Cato was a master of a particular kind of Roman cruelty. He was not a sadist who took pleasure in inflicting pain like Lucius. He did not need to be. He was a man for whom the slaves under his charge were not human. They were livestock, instrumentum, tools. His cruelty was the profound, soul-crushing cruelty of absolute indifference. He would ride through the fields on his mule, his face impassive. He did not shout or curse. He would simply point out a slave who was working too slowly, and one of his assistants would deliver a casual, stinging lash with a short whip. It was not done in anger. It was a simple correction, a way of maximizing the efficiency of his tools. He worked Ilara harder than anyone else. He saw her as a broken cog from the city, and it was his job to either hammer her back into a useful shape or discard her. He gave her the hardest rows to weed the heaviest baskets to carry. He assigned her to muck out the stinking animal pens. He was testing her, pushing her to the breaking point, waiting for her to collapse. Ilara endured. She worked until her hands were a mass of calluses, until her back bent into a permanent ache, until her mind was numb with exhaustion. She learned to shut down the thinking feeling part of herself. She focused only on the next weed to be pulled, the next basket to be lifted. To think of Cassius, to think of the library, was a form of self-torture she could not afford. She was no longer Ilara the scholar. She was a beast of burden, and her only thought was to survive until the sun went down. Back in the villa, on the Esquiline Hill, Cassius was living in a hell of his own making. The house was quiet. Ilara was gone. Cornelia was triumphant, her victory absolute. She now ruled the household with an iron hand, constantly reminding Cassius of his duty, of their impending wedding, of the powerful alliances her family brought. But his victory was hollow. The library was just a room full of dead words. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt empty, accusatory. He was haunted by the memory of Ilara's face as she was led away by the look of shattering betrayal in her eyes. He had made his choice, the correct Roman choice, and it had broken him. The guilt was a constant corrosive presence. He could not work. He could not sleep. Lyra watched her master's torment with grim, cynical eyes. He had been a fool, and now he was paying the price. He had sown the wind, and now he was reaping the whirlwind of his own weakness. Unable to bear the silence, the not knowing Cassius did something that was both desperate and selfish. He wrote a letter. He poured his guilt, his regret, his justifications onto a sheet of papyrus. He wrote of the pressure from Cornelia's family, of his duty, of his own cowardice. He wrote that he had not stopped thinking of her, that he had made a terrible mistake. He sealed the scroll and sent it with a trusted courier to the farm in Etruria, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of his own making. The arrival of a courier from the city was a rare event at the farm. When Cato the overseer summoned Ilara from the fields, her heart leaped with a sickening mixture of hope and dread. Cato held out the sealed papyrus scroll, a sneer on his face. "A letter from your master in the city," he said, drawing out the word master with contempt. "It seems the pretty pet has not been entirely forgotten." The other slaves who were nearby stopped their work to stare, their faces filled with a new kind of suspicion. Ilara took the scroll. Her name written in Cassius's elegant, familiar hand was a shock, a brand on her skin. She walked away, her mind in a turmoil. She sat in the shade of an olive tree, the scroll in her lap, her hands trembling. A part of her, the part that still remembered the quiet of the library and the warmth in his eyes, yearned to break the seal. She was desperate to read his words, to hear his apology, to know that he felt a fraction of the agony she was enduring. She longed for the connection, for the reassurance that what they had shared was real. But another part of her, a new part, that had been forged in the crucible of the fields, a part that was hard and calloused, like her own hands held her back. What were his words worth? They were ink on a page sent from a world of comfort and privilege. They could not soothe the ache in her back or heal the sores on her hands. They could not change the fact that he had chosen his world over her. His words were a phantom limb, a painful reminder of something that had been amputated. To read them would be to invite the ghost back into her life, to reopen the wound that was just beginning to scar over. She sat there for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. She held the weight of his letter, the weight of their past in her hands, and she made a choice. Ilara did not open the letter. The decision was a quiet internal declaration of independence. It was the first true choice she had made for herself since the auction. By refusing to read his words, she was refusing to participate in his guilt. She was refusing to be the repository of his regret. She was cutting the final invisible thread of her emotional dependency on him. She rose, tucked the unread scroll into the waist of her tunic, and went back to work, a new quiet resolve in her heart. The days that followed were different. The work was still brutal, the sun still merciless. But something in her had shifted. She was no longer just enduring, waiting for her punishment to end. She was actively surviving. She began to find a new strength, not a strength that came from a master's favor or the hope of a better life, but a strength that came from within. She learned the rhythms of the farm. She learned to use her body efficiently to conserve her energy. Her hands, now a thick web of calluses, no longer bled. Her muscles, once screaming in protest, grew lean and hard. The other slaves, who had once viewed her with contempt, began to see her differently. They saw her quiet, unbreakable resilience. They saw that the city pet was not going to break. A silent, grudging respect began to form. An old woman showed her how to wrap her hands in linen to protect them. A man shared his water skin with her during the hottest part of the day. She was slowly, painfully being accepted into the grim family of the fields. Weeks passed, and no reply to his letter came from Etruria. The silence from Ilara was a far more powerful and eloquent response than any angry words could have been. It was a silence that said, "You no longer exist for me." Cassius's desperation grew. His life in the villa became a waking nightmare. He was a ghost in his own library, the scrolls and books now mocking reminders of a connection he had severed. Every verse of Sappho was an accusation. His relationship with Cornelia was a cold, brittle hell. She had won, and she never let him forget it. She filled the house with her friends, her plans, her ambition. She was the perfect Roman domina, and he loathed her with every fiber of his being. Their conversations were a minefield of unspoken resentments. He began to realize the true nature of his choice. In trying to preserve his world, he had destroyed the only part of it that had ever brought him joy. He had not just banished a slave. He had exiled his own heart. The gilded cage of his life had never felt more like a prison. He was consumed by the need to see her, to speak to her, to somehow undo the damage he had done. But he was a master, and she was a disgraced slave hundreds of miles away. He was trapped by the very power he had chosen to uphold. The season was turning. The olive harvest was beginning a period of even more relentless work at the farm. The slaves gathered each night around a large, smoky cooking fire in the center of their compound, their only source of light and warmth. Ilara had carried the unread scroll with her for weeks. It was a constant physical reminder of her past, a dead weight she no longer wanted to bear. That night, she walked to the fire. The other slaves watched her, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They had all seen the courier arrive weeks ago. They knew what the scroll was. She pulled it from her tunic. The fine papyrus, the elegant script of her name, the master's seal. It was a relic from another life. She looked at it for a long moment, not with longing or hatred, but with a strange, calm detachment. It was the last piece of the girl who had believed in a master's kindness. It was the last link in the gilded leash. With a simple, deliberate movement, she tossed the scroll into the heart of the fire. The other slaves watched in stunned silence. The papyrus caught immediately, the wax seal melting like a tear. The edges curled, blackened, and then the entire scroll burst into a bright, clean flame. His words, his excuses, his regrets, whatever they may have been, turned to smoke and ash and vanished into the dark Etrurian sky. Ilara watched until the last of the scroll was consumed, until nothing remained but a few glowing embers. The act was a ritual, a funeral. It was the burial of a part of herself, the hopeful, naive part that had allowed itself to dream. She felt no triumph, no anger. She felt only a great, profound emptiness, followed by a cold, quiet resolve. The fire had not just destroyed his letter, it had purified her. It had burned away the last vestiges of her dependency, her hope for his salvation, her love. She had been stripped of everything: her home, her family, her freedom, her position of privilege, her hope, and finally her love. And in that absolute emptiness, she found something that could not be taken away. She found herself, a self that was not defined by a master's favor or a scholar's intellect, but by the simple, unyielding fact of her own survival. She was no longer waiting for Cassius to rescue her. She was no longer weeping for the man who had betrayed her. Her illusions were gone. Her heart, she thought, might be broken beyond repair, but her will was not. As she turned away from the fire and walked back towards the darkness of the barracks, she was for the first time in her life truly free. Her body was still in chains, but her mind, finally liberated from the most gilded and dangerous leash of all, was beginning to think for itself. And its first thought was not of love or of sorrow, but of the long, hard road to a freedom that she would have to seize for herself. Winter descended upon the Etrurian countryside, a season of biting winds and cold, hard earth. For the farm slaves, it was a time of grim endurance. The relentless work of the harvest was replaced by the monotonous tasks of mending tools, weaving baskets, and preserving what little food they had. Time, labor, and sorrow had reforged Ilara. The soft, pale scholar from the city was gone, burned away by the sun and scoured by the wind. In her place was a woman, leaner, harder, her skin browned by the sun, her hands a landscape of calluses. The haunted, heartbroken look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. She had learned the economy of movement, the art of conserving strength, the grim calculus of survival. She had been in exile for nearly half a year. The memory of the villa in Rome, of the library of Cassius, had receded, becoming a distant, discolored tapestry of another life belonging to another person. She no longer wept for the girl she had been. That girl was dead, and Ilara was the one who had dug her grave and watched her burn. Her new self was a simpler, harder creature. She expected nothing. She hoped for nothing. She simply existed one day at a time, her will forged into a single stubborn point to endure. In the long, cold nights, the slaves would huddle together for warmth in the smoky, drafty barracks. The darkness was a vast, empty thing, and they filled it with stories. They were simple tales, memories of their homelands, crude jokes, and boasts of past glories. One night, to break a particularly grim silence, Ilara spoke. Her voice, quiet and clear, cut through the smoky air. She did not speak of her own past. Instead, she told a story she had read in a scroll, a Greek myth about Demeter and Persephone, about a mother's grief and the coming of winter. The other slaves fell silent, listening. They were uneducated, illiterate people, and they had never heard such a tale told with the precision of a scholar and the quiet passion of an artist. For them, myths were not things to be read. They were things to be lived. After that, they began to ask for more. Night after night, Ilara would reach into the library of her memory and pull out a new story. She told them of the cunning of Odysseus, the hubris of Icarus, the tragic love of Orpheus and Eurydice. She simplified the language, focusing on the core human emotions, love, loss, courage, and folly. She became the storyteller. It was a new role, a new identity. She was not the master's pet or the disgraced scribe. She was the weaver of tales, a keeper of a fire that could warm them in the dead of winter. It was a different kind of power, a power that she gave freely, that connected her to the others, a power that came not from a master's favor, but from the depths of her own mind. Her stories became a bridge. The other slaves who had once shunned her now drew closer, their shared experience in the lamp-lit darkness forging a new kind of community. Through her tales, she began to form a cautious, genuine friendship. Her closest connection was with a woman named Brenna. She was a Thracian, a warrior's daughter, who had been captured in a border skirmish 20 years ago. She was tall, strong, and pragmatic, her face a mask of stoic endurance. Brenna was the unspoken matriarch of the farm slaves, respected for her strength and her deep cynical wisdom. She had watched Ilara's transformation with a keen, assessing eye. She had seen the pampered house slave endure the worst of the work without breaking, and she had seen the way the others now looked to her for a story for a brief escape. "You have a strong spirit for a city girl," Brenna said to her one evening, her voice a low rumble. "Stronger than your hands were." "My hands have learned," Ilara replied. "Good," Brenna grunted. "On this farm, it is all that matters. Stories are good for the night, but strength is what gets you to the morning." Their friendship was not one of soft sentiment. It was an alliance of two survivors forged in a shared, unspoken understanding of their world. Brenna saw Ilara's intelligence not as a sign of privilege, but as a useful, dangerous tool. And Ilara saw in Brenna the raw, unyielding strength she herself was only just beginning to discover. Through Brenna and the others, Ilara learned the true, unvarnished history of her world. In the villa, the slaves were isolated, their stories, individual tragedies. Here in the fields, their stories formed a single brutal tapestry. They spoke of the ones who had tried to run. Two brothers from Gaul, caught within a day, were crucified on the main road to the farm, their bodies left for a week as a lesson. They spoke of the old and the sick, who, when they could no longer work, were not cared for, but sold for a few coins to the faulinista, who supplied bodies for the gladiator schools. Not as fighters, but as live bait for the wild beast hunts. Ilara listened, and her own personal tragedy began to shrink in the face of this vast impersonal cruelty. Her story, with Cassius the favored slave, the jealous betrothed, the master's betrayal, was not, she realized, a unique and epic romance. It was a common, predictable, and almost mundane story. Brenna had heard a dozen variations of it over the years. A master's heart is a dangerous place for a slave to live, the Thracian woman said one night, her eyes on the fire. It is a house built on sand. The tide of his real life, his family, his duty always comes in and washes it away. We are the driftwood left behind. This cold, clear-eyed perspective was a bitter but necessary medicine. It stripped away the last vestiges of Alara's self-pity, her feeling that she had been the victim of a great tragic love. She had not been a victim of love. She had been a victim of a system that allowed one person to own another, and that made any genuine lasting connection between them an absolute impossibility. As the winter began to wane, the harsh overseer, Cato, was recalled to another of the family's estates. He was replaced by a younger, talkative man from the city sent to manage the spring planting. The new overseer brought with him news and gossip from the capital, which he dispensed freely, eager to impress the rustic slaves with his connection to the wider world. He spoke of the social season, of the games, of the latest political scandals. And he spoke of the great wedding planned for the spring, the union of the noble houses of Varus and Cornelius, a powerful match, the overseer said to his assistants, loud enough for all the slaves to hear. Though they say, the young master Cassius Varus is a strange one, a melancholic, spends all his time in that dusty library of his, looks like a man who has lost his favorite dog. Still, the Lady Cornelia will whip him into shape. She has a spine of iron, that one. Alara heard the news without flinching. A few months ago, those words would have been a dagger to her heart. Now, they were just information. The story of a man she had once known. He was getting married. He was unhappy. It was a distant, irrelevant fact, like knowing the name of the emperor or the price of grain. The emotional tie was so completely severed that she felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. He was a character in a book she had finished reading long ago. The new overseer was a bearer of more than just gossip. He was part of a network. A few days after his arrival, he handed a small sealed wax tablet to Brenna. From the villica at the city house, he said. Business. Alara watched, intrigued. Brenna took the tablet and disappeared into the barracks. Later, when they were alone, she showed it to Alara. Lyra. Brenna explained. The overseer in Rome. We are from the same tribe. We have an understanding. We keep each other informed about the master's business, the household's moods. Information is the only weapon we have. It was a revelation to Alara, a secret network, a slave intelligence system operating under the noses of their masters. She looked at the tablet. The message was mostly household business account supply requests, but at the very bottom, Lyra had scratched a final cryptic line. The scholar asks after his lost book. I tell him the book is burned and the story is over. He does not believe me. Brenna looked at Alara, her eyes sharp. You are the lost book, I think. Alara stared at the words. So Cassius was asking about her. Lyra, in her own cynical, protective way, had tried to put an end to it, and he was not letting it go. The knowledge did not spark hope in her heart. It sparked a cold dread. He was a ghost she had already buried, and now he was trying to claw his way out of the grave. Brenna, seeing the look on Alara's face and seeing the tablet in her hand, made a decision. This girl was not the fragile creature she had first appeared to be. She was a survivor, and she had a skill no one else on the farm possessed. You can read this, Brenna stated. It was not a question. And you can write a reply. I can, Alara confirmed. A new alliance was forged. It was not the emotional, volatile bond she had shared with Cassius. It was a partnership of pragmatists, a cynic's alliance. It was based not on affection or hope, but on mutual interest and a shared, clear-eyed understanding of their world. Brenna had the network and the practical wisdom. Ilara had the dangerous, valuable gift of literacy. Lyra is our only true friend in that house, Brenna said. She is hard, but she is one of us. We must keep her informed, and we must use what we know. For the first time since her exile, Ilara felt a sense of agency. She was no longer a passive victim of fate. She was a conspirator, a member of a secret, invisible rebellion that fought not with swords, but with carefully chosen words passed in secret between estates. Their first act as conspirators was small but sharp. Brenna dictated a reply to Lyra, and Ilara wrote it, her hand once again finding the familiar rhythm of the stylus, mimicking the rough, simple script of a semi-literate person. The reply contained the usual farm reports. But at Brenna's instruction, Ilara wove in subtle details designed to cause trouble for Cato, the cruel former overseer who was now managing another Varus property. She detailed how the grain stores had been poorly managed under his watch, leading to rot. She mentioned that the olive yield was lower than it should have been due to his neglect of the trees. They were small, undeniable truths, but when collected and presented in a formal report, they would paint a picture of incompetence. A master does not like his tools to be mishandled, Brenna said with a grim smile. Let us see if Cato enjoys a taste of the master's displeasure. It was a small, petty act of sabotage, but it was a start. It was Ilara using her intellect not for a doomed love affair, but for a practical, strategic purpose. She was using her master's language and his own system of accounting to sow a small seed of discontent, to wield a tiny amount of power from the very bottom of the hierarchy. It was a more satisfying feeling than any poem she had ever discussed. Spring arrived, and with it, the season of her exile came to an end. The thought of returning to Rome filled her with a dread that was colder than any winter wind. To go back meant returning to the cage. It meant being in the same house as Cassius the ghost and Cornelia the serpent. It meant living a life of constant suffocating emotional tension. The farm, for all its brutality, was a simpler world. Here she knew her place. She knew her allies. Here she was a storyteller and a survivor. In Rome, she was just a painful memory, a source of scandal. I cannot go back. She confessed to Brenna one evening. You are his property. Brenna stated the simple, brutal truth. You go where you are told to go. But what if there was a way? Ilara pressed her mind, so long dormant, beginning to work again. What if I were more useful elsewhere? What if Lyra could persuade the master that I am needed at the seaside villa to catalog the scrolls there? Or what if I could be sold? The idea was shocking. To wish to be sold was to wish for the ultimate uncertainty. But to Ilara, it represented a different kind of freedom. Not true freedom, but a freedom from him. To be sold away from the house of Varus entirely would be to finally truly close that chapter of her life. It would be a new start, a new servitude, but one unburdened by the ghosts of a forbidden love. It was a spark of an idea, a desperate calculated plan for a new kind of survival. Before their nascent plans could take any shape, their fate was decided for them. A courier from Rome arrived, this one, a legionary, from the master's personal staff, not a common messenger. He carried an official order, sealed with the Varus family signet. The new overseer read it and summoned Ilara. His face was a mask of confusion. Pack your things, he said, which was a joke, as she had nothing but the clothes on her back. You are being recalled to the city by the master's personal command. The words were a death sentence to her fragile peace. She was being summoned back. Back to the villa, back to the library, back to the cage. Why? She asked, her voice hollow. The order does not give a reason, the overseer said, shrugging. It only commands. You leave at dawn. Ilara stood in the dusty farmyard, the warm spring sun on her face, and felt a winter's chill grip her soul. Her season of exile was over. She had been freed from him in her heart. She had burned his words and buried her love in the ashes. But she had been a fool to think it was over. Her body was still his property. She was a piece on his board, and for reasons she could not fathom, he had decided to move her back into the center of the game. She had to return to Rome, but she would not return as the same girl who had left. She would return as a survivor, her heart shielded by the cold, hard truth of her condition, armed with new allies and a resolve of iron. The scholar was returning to the library, but this time she was reading a very different story. The journey back to Rome was a journey into a past she had already buried. Ilara walked with the same grim silence as before, but this time the silence was not one of despair, but of cold, hard appraisal. She was no longer a victim being led to her fate. She was a scout returning to enemy territory. Her arrival at the villa was met with an atmosphere of tense, fearful curiosity. The slaves who had once scorned her for her privilege and then for her disgrace now looked at her with an unnerved respect. She was the one who had been sent to the breaking grounds of Etruria and had come back not broken, but harder, quieter, and unreadable. She was an unknown quantity, and that made her dangerous. Lyra greeted her at the service entrance. The overseer's eyes, shrewd and assessing, took in the changes immediately: the calloused hands, the sun-darkened skin, the new, unyielding stillness in Ilara's gaze. So the book returns to the library. Lyra said, her voice a low, non-committal rumble. The story is different now. Ilara replied, her voice flat. It was a quiet declaration. A new chapter was beginning, and she, not the master, would be the one to write it. Her first meeting with Cassius took place as she knew it would in the library. The room was the same, filled with the familiar scent of papyrus and the quiet ghosts of dead poets. But the man was not. He was thinner, his face etched with fine lines of stress that had not been there before. The scholarly peace that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a restless, unhappy energy. When he saw her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic cocktail of guilt, relief, and longing. Ilara, he breathed, taking a step toward her. You are back. She did not move. She simply bowed her head in the gesture of a proper slave. Dominus, she said, her voice a wall of ice. He flinched, as if she had slapped him. Her cold formality was a more brutal rejection than any shouted accusation. Please, he began, his voice pleading. I know you hate me. You have every right. What I did, it was unforgivable. I have been in torment since the day you left. She listened to his words, his confession, with a distant clinical detachment. This was the man who had held her heart, the man who had betrayed her. And she felt nothing. No anger, no pity, nothing. The fire she had lit on the farm had burned away everything, leaving only cold ash. I am your slave, Dominus. She said, her voice empty of all emotion. My feelings are of no consequence. I have been recalled. I await your orders. Her emotional distance was a new kind of cage, one he could not breach. He was the master of her body, but he had lost all purchase on her soul. And the realization of it left him looking utterly hopelessly lost. Frustrated by her coldness, Cassius revealed the true selfish reason for her recall. His lie to Cornelia had become a trap of his own making. The wedding is in a month. He explained, pacing the library like a caged animal. Cornelia. She has not forgotten my project. She speaks of it constantly. She asks to see the progress. She uses it as a weapon, a way to remind me of her indulgence. He stopped and looked at her, his desperation plain. My father's notes are a disaster. I cannot make sense of them alone. I need you. I need your help to create something, anything, a few translated chapters, a coherent outline. Something to show her, to prove the lie is true. To keep the peace until he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Until I am shackled to her forever. The revelation was almost comical in its pathetic self-interest. He had not recalled her out of love or even regret. He had recalled her because he was a poor liar, and he needed her help to maintain his deception. He had banished her to appease his fiancée, and now he had brought her back for the very same reason. I understand, Dominus. Ilara, said the cold stone in her chest solidifying. I will assist you with the master's legacy. She was a tool being picked up again after a season of disuse. The knowledge did not hurt her. It simply clarified everything. Ilara's return to the library began a new bizarre chapter in their relationship. It was a torturous pantomime of their former intimacy. They worked together for hours, their heads bent over the same texts, but the easy companionship was gone, replaced by a tense, brutally professional distance. She was the perfect scribe, efficient, intelligent, and utterly impersonal. Cornelia was a constant, triumphant presence in the villa, which was now a whirlwind of preparations for the grand wedding. She had won, and she took every opportunity to display her victory. She would sweep into the library, ostensibly, to ask Cassius a question about the ceremony, but really to observe him and Ilara. She and Ilara engaged in a silent, bitter war. Cornelia would issue a petty, condescending command. Girl, fetch me a glass of water. And Ilara would obey instantly. Her movements flew at her face, a perfect, infuriating mask of blank obedience. She gave Cornelia no reaction, no flicker of resentment, no purchase for her cruelty. Her emotionless servitude was its own form of defiance, a wall against which Cornelia's barbs glanced off harmlessly. The two women circled each other like scorpions, one wielding the power of her station, the other the power of her absolute, unbreakable self-control. The Varus family, while old and respected, had seen its fortunes decline in recent years. Their wealth was primarily in agriculture and shipping. As the wedding preparations reached a fever pitch, demanding a huge outlay of capital, a disaster struck. A courier arrived, his face grim, bearing a message from the family's agent at Ostia, the port of Rome. A storm, sudden and violent, had swept up the coast. Two of the Varus family's largest merchant ships, laden with a season's worth of olive oil from Hispania and grain from Egypt, had been caught in the squall and had sunk with all hands and all cargo. The financial loss was catastrophic. It represented nearly a third of Cassius's liquid assets. The news came at the worst possible time, throwing the wedding finances into chaos and making Cassius suddenly desperately vulnerable. The news of his weakened financial position spread quickly through the gossiping circles of the elite. This was compounded by political trouble. Senator Scipio, Cornelia's father, seeing Cassius's weakness, began to apply pressure. He suggested that given the unfortunate losses, perhaps it would be wise for Cassius to transfer control of some of his landholdings, specifically the profitable Etrurian farm, to the Cornelii family, as part of the marriage settlement, a gesture of good faith. Cassius was being squeezed his finances, and his future being brought under the thumb of his powerful future father-in-law. The foundations of his house were cracking under the strain. Cornelia saw her moment. Her fiancé was weakened, financially desperate, and politically besieged. The time for subtle torments and silent wars was over. It was time for the final killing stroke. She confronted him in the library, in the very heart of his sanctuary. Alara was present, quietly working a silent witness to the final act of the drama. This fiction about your father's work is over. Cornelia said, her voice calm and deadly. I have tolerated your eccentricities, your attachment to your scribe. I have tolerated it because I am a dutiful Roman daughter. But my patience has its limits. She looked from Cassius's pale face to Alara. I know this is a lie. I have known it from the beginning. And I will not begin my marriage with a lie, or with a Greek whore living under my roof. Cornelia, you go too far, Cassius stammered. Do I? She laughed, a cold, sharp sound. My father is concerned about this marriage. He is concerned about your judgment, your stability. If I were to go to him now with the story of your sordid affair, if I were to tell him how you have been neglecting your duties, lying to your betrothed, obsessing over a slave, what do you think he would do? He would not just withdraw his support. He would crush you. In your current financial state, you would be ruined. Utterly. It was a brilliant, brutal checkmate. She had him trapped. I will give you a choice, Cassius. Cornelia continued, circling him like a shark. You have two paths before you, and you will choose one today. The first path is your ruin. I will go to my father. I will tell him everything. Our betrothal will be broken. Your name will be a laughingstock in the Senate. My father will ensure your creditors call in their loans. You will be a pauper before the summer is out. She let the threat hang in the air, then she outlined the second path, or... She said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You can prove your loyalty to me, to my family, to Rome. You will agree to my father's generous proposal regarding the Etrurian farm. You will set the date for our wedding next week, and you will deal with your distraction. She finally turned her full, venomous attention to Alara. You will get rid of her, Cornelia commanded, and not by sending her away again. That leaves a loose end, a lingering attachment. No, you will do it properly. You will do what any sensible Roman master does with a flawed or inconvenient piece of property. You will sell her. You will sell her at the public auction, at the Forum Boreum. I want to see it done. I want the entire city to see you repudiate her. It is the only way I will know that this sickness is finally purged from you. It is the only way I will know you are truly mine. The terms were absolute. They were designed not just to remove Alara, but to inflict the maximum possible humiliation on both her and Cassius. To be sold at a public auction was the ultimate degradation, a return to the absolute beginning, to the horror of the turning block. After Cornelia swept from the room, leaving her ultimatum hanging in the air like the scent of poison, Cassius collapsed into his chair. He was a man completely and utterly broken. He had been outmaneuvered, trapped, and defeated at every turn. He looked at Alara. his eyes filled with a desperate pleading agony. The mask of the master was gone forever. There was only a weak, terrified man in its place. "She has me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "There is no way out. If I refuse, I am ruined. My family name, my father's house, everything, gone." He buried his face in his hands. "She wants to sell you Ilara, to put you on the block, like an animal." He looked up, his face a mess of tears and despair. "I cannot do it. I will not. But if I don't," he was pleading with her. The master of the house, the man who held the power of her life and death, was pleading with his slave for a solution he was too weak to find himself. He was asking her to absolve him, to understand him, to somehow save him from the consequences of his own choices. He had promised, in the darkness of her cell, to defy the world for her. And now, when the world had finally called his bluff, he had crumbled. Ilara listened to his pathetic, broken confession. She looked at the man who had bought her, who had been kind to her, who had taught her, who had kissed her, who had betrayed her, and who was now weeping before her. And the last flicker of any emotion she had for him, love, hate, anger, was extinguished. All that was left was a cold, profound pity. He was just another casualty of the system they both lived in, a weak man, crushed by the expectations of his world. She felt nothing for him. But his complete collapse presented an opportunity. Not for love, not for reconciliation, but for survival. She thought of her secret network, of Lyra in the villa, of Brenna on the farm. They were her only hope. She needed to get a message out. She needed to control the narrative of her own destruction, if only by a small fraction. She let him weep for a moment longer. She let his desperation reach its peak. Then she spoke, her voice, not gentle, not forgiving, but calm, level, and pragmatic. She would speak to him now, not as a lover or a victim, but as a strategist. "You are right, Dominus," Ilara said, her voice cutting through his despair like a cold, clean blade. "You have no choice. You must do as she says." He looked up, shocked by her cold pragmatism. "Your ruin will not help me," she continued. "A ruined master's slaves are sold off to the highest bidder anyway. Your only path is to obey her. But you can do so on your own terms." She leaned forward, her eyes holding his, forcing him to focus. "She wants a public humiliation. She wants to see me on the block. But the scandal of it will harm you as much as it harms me. The story of the besotted master forced to sell his pet will be all over the forum. It will make you look weak, a man controlled by his wife." She saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. She was appealing to the one thing he had left, his pride. "There is another way," she said. "A private sale. It is discreet. It is final. It achieves her goal of removing me, but it saves you the public spectacle. You can tell her it is a better way, a more dignified way, to close this chapter. You can tell her it is the act of a decisive master, not a humiliated lover." He stared at her, seeing the cold, brilliant logic of her plan. "I will go quietly," Ilara said, pressing her final desperate bargain. "I will not cause a scene. I will disappear from your life. In return, you will do this one thing for me. You will not sell me to the public pens. You will sell me privately through a dealer, a specific dealer whose name I will provide to you. It is a small request, a final act of kindness." He was so broken, so desperate for any path that was not the one Cornelia had laid out for him, that he agreed immediately. "Yes," he whispered. Yes, of course. Anything. He did not ask who the dealer was. He did not care. He was simply grateful for the lifeline she had thrown him. That night, Ilara sent a coded message to Lyra. Lyra was to contact Brenna. Their secret network had a contact, a disreputable slave trader on the fringes of the city, who owed them favors, a man who specialized in discreet acquisitions. It was not a plan for freedom. It was a desperate gamble to fall into a slightly better cage. The great house of Varys was unraveling, collapsing into its own rotten foundations. And Ilara, a slave to the very end, was trying to grasp a single thread in the ruins to guide the direction of her own fall. The arrangements were made with a chilling clandestine efficiency. Lyra's secret network moved swiftly. The name of a slave trader, a man named Syros, was given to Ilara, who in turn gave it to Cassius. Syros was not a mainstream mango from the Forum Boreum. He was a man of the shadows, a freedman himself, who operated out of a dusty office in the Subura, specializing in discreet transactions, slaves with complicated pasts, debts to be settled with human property, the quiet removal of inconvenient persons. He arrived at the villa at dusk, a small, wiry man with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. The transaction took place not in the grand atrium, but in a small private office near the service entrance. It was a cold, clinical affair. Cassius, his face pale and drawn, handed over the legal documents of ownership, the small clay tablet that served as Ilara's deed. Syros inspected it. His lips pursed. A bag of coins was exchanged a fraction of what Cassius had paid for her, the standard price for a used, disgraced slave. Ilara stood by the door, a silent witness to her own sale. She was a line item in a ledger, a commodity being transferred. Cassius did not look at her. He could not. The rustle of the documents was the only sound in the room, the final dry whisper of their story. While Syros concluded his business with the Villicus, Decimus Ilara had a few moments to herself. She did not go to the library. That room was a graveyard, and she had no desire to visit the ghosts. Instead, she sought out Lyra, finding her in the main courtyard, overseeing the lighting of the evening lamps. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary between them now. Lyra simply looked at her, a long, assessing gaze. It was a look of grim, profound respect. The girl she had once scorned as a fool had navigated the treacherous currents of the house, and against all odds had found a way to influence her own fall. Lyra reached into a fold of her gray stola and produced a small utilitarian object. It was a knife with a short, sharp blade and a simple bone handle. For the road, Lyra said, her voice a low rumble. Every woman should have a tool to cut her own bread, and other things if need be. It was the highest compliment the cynical overseer could give. It was an acknowledgement of Ilara as a survivor, a fellow traveler in their brutal world. Ilara took the knife, its weight small, but significant in her hand. She gave Lyra one last grateful nod. It was a farewell between two former slaves, two women who understood the true unwritten laws of power and survival. As Ilara and Syros prepared to leave through a side entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows of the atrium. It was Cassius. His hair was disheveled, his toga askew. The mask of the stoic Roman noble was completely gone, leaving only the raw, desperate face of a broken man. "Stop!" he said, his voice hoarse. He looked at Syros. "Leave us, for a moment." Syros, sensing the last act of a private drama, gave a slight bow and retreated a few paces, his expression one of bored indifference. Cassius turned to Alara, his eyes wild with a desperate last-minute plea. "Don't go," he whispered. "I cannot do this. I was wrong. I will not." He reached out, grabbing her arm. "I will tell Cornelia the truth. I will face her father. I will face the Senate. Let them ruin me. I do not care. To live in that house with her without you, it is a ruin of a different kind, a ruin of the soul. Stay, Alara. We will face it together." It was the speech she had once dreamed of hearing. The grand declaration of love, the choice to defy the world for her. A year ago, she would have wept with joy. She would have thrown herself into his arms. Now she simply stood there, his hand on her arm, and felt a profound aching pity. She looked at him, at this man, who was offering her a place by his side in the inferno he had created. And she saw his offer for what it was not a rescue, but another more dramatic form of imprisonment. He was not offering her freedom. He was asking her to be his fellow prisoner, to be the noble reason for his self-destruction, to be the beautiful, tragic centerpiece of his ruin. It was the ultimate act of selfishness dressed in the language of love. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but as unyielding as the marble floor beneath their feet. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "But I am choosing you over everything. You are choosing to set your own world on fire," she replied, her voice still a whisper, but with an edge of cold, hard-won truth. "And you are asking me to burn with you. I will not." She looked around the grand, shadowy atrium, at the ancestral busts, at the frescoes of Roman glory. "The love I felt for you, Cassius, was a fantasy. It was a flower that could only grow in the silent, sunlit world of your library. It cannot survive in the real world. It cannot survive the truth of this house, the truth of what I am and what you are." She gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm. It was the final reversal. The slave was now the one severing the bond. The property was the one walking away. "The only true kindness you can offer me now," she said, her voice softening with a flicker of that old tragic affection, "is to let me go. Truly let me go." She did not wait for his response. She turned her back on him, on the man who had been her master, her teacher, her lover, her betrayer. She walked towards Syros, who was waiting patiently by the door. She did not look back. She did not want to see the image of him, standing alone and broken in the magnificent empty atrium of his house, a king of a ruined kingdom. Syros opened the small side gate, a door she had never used before. She stepped through it from the manicured, ordered world of the villa into the dark, chaotic reality of a Roman alleyway. The gate clicked shut behind her. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was the sound of a book closing. It was the sound of a final painful and absolute liberation. Syros did not lead her to the slave pens or the market. He led her through a labyrinth of back streets to a small, unremarkable house near the Tiber. Inside, a woman was waiting. It was Lyra. Alara stared confused. Lyra was supposed to be at the villa. "Brenna sends her regards." Lyra said, her voice holding its usual dry tone. "She and I have been putting aside a small portion of the household funds for years, for emergencies." Syros grunted. "The women paid me well," he said. "They paid your purchase price and a generous fee for my services." He looked at Alara, his shrewd eyes assessing her. "According to this," he held up the ownership tablet, "you are now my property. But the deal I made with them was of a different nature." He took a stylus and on the back of the tablet he wrote a short formal declaration. He signed his name. It was a declaration of manumission. "You are now a freedwoman a liberta," Ciro said, handing her the tablet. "Legally, you are free." A wave of dizziness swept over Alara. Free. The word was so vast, so impossible, she could barely comprehend it. But freedom is not without a price. Cyrus continued, his voice all business. "The Women's Fund was not quite enough to cover my full fee and the risk I am taking. You owe me a debt. You are a skilled scribe. My import-export business has a great need for a discreet accountant who can keep my records in order. You will work for me here in Rome for 2 years. You will be paid a small wage enough for food and lodging. When the 2 years are up, your debt is paid. Then you are truly free." And so, Ilara's new life began. She had traded one form of bondage for another. She was no longer a slave, a piece of property. She was an indebted freedwoman, her labor bound to her new patron for a fixed period. Her new cage was a small, cramped room above Cyros's office, and the bars were made not of iron, but of numbers in a ledger. Her work was grim. She spent her days cataloging the true ugly commerce of the empire. She recorded shipments of slaves from Britannia, of smuggled goods, from Egypt, of debts and loans enforced by brutality. She was now a bookkeeper for the very system that had once enslaved her. It was a world without poetry, without philosophy. It was a world of cold, hard numbers that represented human misery. But it was different. She was paid a wage. She could walk the streets of Rome, a humble, invisible freedwoman. And at the end of her servitude, there was a true final end. There was a path out. It was a harsh, morally compromising existence, but it was a rung up the ladder from the absolute powerlessness she had known before. A month after she left the villa, the city was filled with talk of the grand wedding. The union of Cassius Verus and Cornelia Scipio took place, a magnificent public spectacle designed to silence the rumors and solidify the power of the two great houses. Ilara, from the anonymity of the crowd, watched the wedding procession pass in the forum. She saw Cornelia radiant and triumphant in her bridal gown, the perfect Roman matron. And she saw Cassius. He looked like a beautifully dressed corpse, his face pale and empty, his eyes looking at nothing. He was going through the motions, a ghost at his own wedding. He had made his choice, and now he would live in the gilded, loveless cage he had chosen for the rest of his life. Ilara watched them pass, and she felt a faint, distant echo of a pain that was no longer hers. It was like remembering a story she had read long ago about a foolish girl and a sad, weak man. She turned away from the procession and disappeared back into the crowded anonymity of the city, leaving their story behind her for good. Ilara worked. For 2 years, she lived a quiet Spartan life. She kept Cyros's books with a meticulous, flawless efficiency. She saved nearly every coin of her small wage. She learned the city's rhythms, its dangers, its hidden paths. She learned to be self-reliant. The soft, scholarly girl from Athens and the heartbroken lover from the villa were gone forever. In their place was a woman forged in the fires of servitude and betrayal, her spirit as hard and as sharp as the small knife Lyra had given her. Her freedom was not a gift. It was a thing she earned day by day, through morally gray work that stained her soul. She knew that the price of her personal liberty was her participation in a system that created countless other slaves. It was a bitter, complex truth, and it taught her the final, hardest lesson of her life, that in the Roman world, there was no clean escape, no pure freedom. There was only the struggle and the compromises one had to make to survive. 2 years, to the day, after she had walked out of the villa, Syros called her into his office. "Your debt is paid," he said, his voice holding a rare, almost imperceptible note of respect. "You are a good accountant. You may stay on for a proper wage if you wish." "Thank you," Ilara said, "but I have other plans." The next week, Ilara stood on the deck of a merchant ship at the bustling port of Ostia. She had a small bag, with her containing a change of clothes, her manumission papers, Lyra's knife, and a modest purse of coins she had earned. She was no one's property. She was no one's debt. She was her own. The ship was heading east towards the Greek Isles. She was not going back to Athens. That world was gone. She was heading towards a new life, a future she could not yet see, a story whose pages were completely unwritten. As the ship pulled away from the dock, she looked back at the sprawling, magnificent, and terrible land of Italy. It was the place that had taken everything from her, and in doing so had taught her everything she needed to know. The sea breeze was cool on her face. She was alone. She was scarred. She was free. The story of the master and the slave was over. The story of Ilara the freedwoman was just beginning. And so, our story ends. It ends not with a triumphant wedding or a tragic death, but with a solitary figure on the deck of a ship sailing towards an unknown horizon. We have journeyed with Ilara through the depths of despair and the intoxicating heights of a forbidden, impossible love. We have seen how a bond, born of kindness and intellectual connection, could never truly escape the poison of the power imbalance from which it sprang. Her story is a tragedy, but it is also a story of profound resilience. It explores the true meaning of freedom. Ilara's ultimate liberation was not the moment she escaped the villa, but the moment she extinguished the hope that her master could save her. It was the moment she chose the brutal uncertainty of the world over the gilded cage of his affection. Her physical freedom, when it came, was not a gift, but a debt, a complex and morally gray transaction that reminds us that the paths out of oppression are rarely clean or simple. The love between Ilara and Cassius was real in its way. It was a real and powerful connection between two lonely souls. But it was a love that was fundamentally fatally flawed, for it could not exist between equals. It was a hothouse flower that could only bloom in the unnatural atmosphere of the master-slave dynamic. Once exposed to the harsh light of reality, it had to wither. Cassius's final tragedy was his realization that in choosing his world, he had lost his soul. Ilara's final victory was her realization that to truly save her soul, she had to leave him and their shared impossible dream behind. This story is an echo, a whisper of a love that was doomed from its first poetic question. It is a reminder that the human heart, in its desperate search for connection, can find beauty even in the darkest of places. But it is also a testament to the fact that true love cannot coexist with ownership, and that the most profound liberation is not the freedom to be with another, but the freedom to finally truly be one's own. Thank you for listening.